Every year, millions of tourists walk across the sand at Giza, cameras raised, capturing the pyramids from every angle. They stand in the Valley of the Kings, peering into tombs where pharaohs once slept. They marvel at hieroglyphs carved into temple walls, symbols frozen in stone for thousands of years. But beneath their feet, beneath the surface of what they see and photograph, lie answers to questions we haven't even learned to ask yet. We like to think of history as a straight line moving upward, from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to enlightened, from darkness into light. But what if that's not how it works? What if civilizations can know things, master them completely, and then forget them so thoroughly that thousands of years later we're still trying to figure out what they understood? Ancient Egypt existed longer than most of us can comprehend. The Great Pyramid was already ancient when Cleopatra ruled. It was older to her than she is to us. For 3,000 years, Egyptian priests walked into temples each morning, performing rituals and preserving knowledge that had been passed down through generations so long that its origins were lost even to them. And when that civilization finally fell, when the last priest died and the last temple closed, entire branches of understanding vanished as if they had never existed. Greek historians who visited Egypt wrote about what they saw, and their accounts read like fantasy. Herodotus described Egyptian priests who could predict the flooding of the Nile years in advance, who performed surgical procedures that shouldn't have been possible with bronze tools, who built structures aligned to stars with precision. We struggle to match with modern instruments. For centuries, scholars dismissed these accounts as exaggeration. Now, as we excavate and analyze what remains, we're discovering that Herodotus might have actually understated what the Egyptians could do. They understood the stars in ways that wouldn't be matched until the invention of telescopes. They performed medical procedures that Europe wouldn't rediscover for 2,000 years. They worked stone with techniques we still can't fully explain. They developed mathematics that seems to have anticipated concepts we consider modern discoveries. And they did all of this while we assume they were primitive people with primitive tools, building monuments through nothing but brute force and unlimited slave labor. But here's what should keep us awake at night. We live in an age where knowledge seems permanent. We store everything in the cloud, in databases, in digital archives that we assume will last forever. Yet we've all experienced that moment of panic when a hard drive fails, when a file becomes corrupted, when crucial information exists only in the mind of one specialist who just retired or passed away. Now imagine that happening not to a single file or a single person, but to an entire civilization. Imagine every university closing simultaneously, every hospital, every research institution. Imagine the people who know things scattering, dying, taking their knowledge with them because they never had a chance to pass it on. That's what happened to Egypt. Not overnight, but gradually, inevitably, completely. The priests who understood how to align temples to celestial coordinates died without teaching anyone. The physicians who could perform brain surgery took their techniques to the grave. The architects who knew how to move and place 100-ton stones left no blueprints, no instruction manuals, no detailed records we can find. They built monuments that still stand after 4,500 years. Yet we can't find a single complete explanation of how they did it. So we're left with questions that become more unsettling the longer you think about them. What did the pharaohs know that died with them? What discoveries did Egyptian priests make that we're now rediscovering, thinking we're the first? And most disturbing of all, what if some of that lost knowledge could change everything we believe about what humans are capable of achieving? They called them Per-Ankh, the houses of life. The name itself hints at something beyond simple libraries or schools. These institutions stood at the heart of Egyptian civilization, but most people who walked past them had no idea what happened inside. The walls were thick, the doors were guarded, and the knowledge preserved within was considered so valuable, so dangerous, that only those who had proven themselves worthy through years of initiation were allowed to enter. Imagine walking into one of these spaces at the height of Egyptian power. The air would smell of papyrus and incense, that distinctive mixture of paper and sacred smoke that marked places where important things happened. You'd hear the sound of young initiates reciting mathematical formulas in unison, their voices echoing off stone walls. In one chamber, senior priests would be dissecting bodies, studying anatomy with a clinical precision that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. In another, astronomers would be calculating the movements of stars, tracking cycles so long that a single human lifetime couldn't hope to observe them complete. The House of Life wasn't just one thing. It was university, hospital, research center, and mystical academy, all combined into a single institution. Young men who showed promise would enter as teenagers and spend the next 30 or 40 years learning everything the priests knew: astronomy and medicine, mathematics and theology, the properties of plants and minerals, the movements of celestial bodies, the structure of the human body, the techniques for preserving knowledge across generations. But here's where it gets interesting, where the system reveals both its genius and its fatal flaw. Yes, they wrote things down. Papyrus scrolls filled rooms, covered with hieratic script, documenting everything from medical procedures to mathematical formulas. But the truly important knowledge, the deep understanding that made someone a master rather than just a student, that didn't live on papyrus. It lived in human memory, passed directly from teacher to student through oral tradition and practical demonstration. This created a system more resilient than any library. Fire couldn't destroy it. Floods couldn't wash it away. Invaders couldn't burn it. The knowledge existed in the minds of people who had spent decades memorizing and understanding it, who could recreate texts from memory if necessary, who carried entire libraries in their heads. But it also created a terrible vulnerability. If the chain of transmission broke, if a generation of teachers died before passing on what they knew, that knowledge died with them. Completely. Permanently. And the priests knew certain things that they believed shouldn't be shared widely. They developed elaborate initiation rites, symbolic languages, coded texts that could only be understood by those who had received the proper training. Modern scholars debate why they did this. Was it about power? About maintaining control by monopolizing knowledge? Perhaps. But maybe they genuinely believed some discoveries were dangerous in the wrong hands. Maybe they understood that certain knowledge, without the wisdom to use it properly, could cause more harm than good. For 3,000 years, this system worked. Generation after generation of priests walked into the houses of life, learned from their masters, and eventually became masters themselves, teaching the next generation. The knowledge flowed like a river, continuous and pure. But then, Egypt began to fall, not quickly, but inexorably. The Persians came, then the Greeks, then the Romans. Each conquest weakened the old institutions a little more. Some houses of life were destroyed, others were converted to different purposes. The priests scattered, died, were absorbed into new cultures that didn't value what they knew. And the knowledge dissolved like salt in water. It didn't disappear all at once. It faded gradually, piece by piece, until nothing remained but fragments, hints, and the monuments they left behind, like messages we can see but can't quite read. For 3,000 years, these temples held secrets that shaped a civilization. Then in just 3 centuries, they were destroyed, converted, abandoned. The priests who knew the truth died without successors, and we're left wondering what they were protecting so carefully that it couldn't survive their fall. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 before the Common Era, he didn't just open a door to Egyptian riches, he opened a door to Egyptian knowledge. And Greek intellectuals poured through that door, eager to learn from a civilization that had been ancient when Greece was still young. They came with notebooks and questions. They studied with Egyptian priests. They copied texts and documented rituals. And they left thinking they had captured the wisdom of Egypt. But they hadn't. Not really. They'd captured pieces, fragments, the outer layers of something much deeper that they couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't that the Greeks were stupid. Far from it. They were brilliant mathematicians and philosophers, arguably the finest minds of their age. But they were trying to understand one system of knowledge through the framework of a completely different system, and crucial things got lost in the translation. Take geometry, for example. Pythagoras traveled to Egypt and studied for years with Egyptian priests. He learned geometry from them, brought it back to Greece, and Greek mathematics flourished as a result. We still call certain principles by Greek names because we learned them from Greek sources. But what the Greeks didn't understand was that Egyptian geometry wasn't just practical mathematics. It was connected to sacred architecture, to cosmic principles, to a worldview where numbers weren't just abstractions, but living realities that connected Earth to heaven. The Greeks took the practical applications and missed the philosophical foundations that made those applications meaningful. They did the same thing with medicine. Greek physicians learned from Egyptian doctors. They documented treatments and surgical techniques, but they missed the holistic approach that connected physical health with spiritual balance, that understood disease as disruption of harmony rather than just physical malfunction. They copied the recipes without understanding why those particular ingredients worked together. They learned the procedures without grasping the diagnostic principles that determined when to use which procedure. And Egyptian religion? The Greeks documented it extensively. Temple rituals, prayers, offerings, the whole elaborate system. But they interpreted everything through Greek philosophical frameworks, through their own ideas about gods and nature and reality. It would be like trying to understand quantum physics through poetry. You'd capture the beauty and miss the mechanics. You'd have descriptions without comprehension, words without understanding. This is where we face an uncomfortable truth. Much of what we think we know about ancient Egypt doesn't come from Egyptian sources directly. It comes filtered through Greek interpretation, passed through minds that were trying to understand but couldn't quite make the leap. The Greeks preserved fragments, and for that we should be grateful, because without those fragments we'd know even less. But they couldn't preserve context. They couldn't capture the unwritten understanding that made written texts comprehensible. They recorded rituals, but not their meaning. They copied formulas, but not the wisdom behind them. So we're looking at ancient Egypt through a distorted lens, trying to reconstruct something magnificent from shadows and reflections. Even our best sources are incomplete translations, second-hand accounts, fragments interpreted by people who admitted they didn't fully understand what they were documenting. And if we struggle to comprehend what the Greeks did manage to write down, what about everything they never learned? What about the knowledge the Egyptian priests deliberately withheld, showing outsiders only what they believed foreigners could handle? The Greeks thought they were documenting Egyptian wisdom. In a way, they were. But the priests showed them the surface, the acceptable face, the knowledge deemed safe for foreign consumption. The real secrets, the deep understanding that took decades to earn the right to learn, those died in silence. They died locked behind symbolic language the Greeks couldn't crack, buried in oral traditions that ended when the last initiated priests passed away without successors. The Greeks stole fragments and thought they had treasure. And we inherited those fragments, calling them ancient wisdom, never quite realizing how much more there might have been. Look up at the ceiling of the Temple of Dendera, and you'll see something that shouldn't exist. Carved into massive stone panels, covering an area larger than most modern apartments, is a map of the night sky. Not a simple decoration, not religious symbolism rendered in abstract forms. An actual astronomical chart, meticulously detailed, depicting stars and constellations and celestial events with a precision that makes modern astronomers pause and recalculate their assumptions about what ancient people could know. The temple itself dates to around 50 years before the birth of Christ. But the knowledge carved into that ceiling represents something accumulated across thousands of years. You can see it in the details. The zodiac constellations, which most people assume originated with the Greeks, appear here in forms that predate Greek astronomy by centuries. The positions of planets, frozen in stone, marking their locations at specific moments in time. The precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle, somehow understood and recorded by people who weren't supposed to know Earth had an axis at all. Here's what makes it strange. The Egyptians carved this without telescopes, without computers running calculations, without satellites photographing Earth from space, without even basic photography to record what they saw night after night. They had naked eyes and patience, and an obsession with accuracy that borders on incomprehensible. The level of detail in these star maps suggests centuries of continuous observation, with data passed down through generations of priest astronomers who spent entire lifetimes tracking tiny movements across the darkness. And they weren't just watching casually. Archaeological evidence reveals pyramid shafts aligned to specific stars, with tolerances measured in fractions of degrees. Temple doorways positioned so precisely that sunlight penetrates inner chambers only on particular days of the year, illuminating specific statues at specific moments with an accuracy you could set your watch by. These construction projects required understanding Earth's rotation, its axial tilt, its position in space relative to stars millions of miles away. The mathematics involved weren't simple arithmetic. They needed trigonometry, spherical geometry, and the ability to compile observational data across timescales that exceeded any individual human memory. But here's where it gets deeper. The Egyptians didn't track the stars just for religious festivals or to impress future archaeologists. They were tracking something. Their astronomical knowledge connected directly to calendar systems that predicted Nile floods, growing seasons, and celestial events with remarkable accuracy. Farmers needed to know when to plant. Priests needed to know when to perform rituals. Everyone needed to know when the life-giving flood would arrive. The stars told them everything, yet their texts referenced something more. Great cycles, returns of the sky, cosmic patterns that repeated across timescales far longer than a single human lifetime, longer than a dynasty, longer than what should have concerned anyone living a finite existence in the desert. They were tracking phenomena that wouldn't complete during their children's lives, or their children's children's lives. They watched the heavens with the patience of people who understood that some knowledge takes generations to gather and must be preserved no matter the cost. What were they watching for? Why did they consider this celestial knowledge so important that they carved it into stone, encoded it into the architecture of monuments designed to outlast empires, and created systems to ensure it would never be forgotten? The star maps at Dendera aren't just scientific records. They're messages, they're warnings, they're attempts to communicate something across the vast gulf of time, speaking to whoever would come after them and look up and understand. Without telescopes or computers, they tracked stars we can barely see. They predicted celestial events thousands of years in advance, and they carved it all in stone, as if saying, "Remember this, no matter what happens." The precision is undeniable, the effort is extraordinary, but the purpose remains hidden in plain sight, written in a language of stellar positions and geometric alignments that we're only beginning to decode. If they could track the heavens with such obsessive accuracy, the question becomes unavoidable. What were they using this knowledge for? The ancient Egyptians didn't experience time the way we do. For us, time is a line stretching from past to future, each moment occurring once and never returning. We measure our lives in linear progression: childhood, adulthood, old age, death, forward, always forward, never back. But the Egyptians understood something different, something that modern physics is only now beginning to appreciate. They knew time could be both arrow and circle simultaneously. They had two words for time. Nehe meant eternal, cyclical time, the kind that repeats, that circles back, that brings the same patterns around again and again, like seasons or the phases of the moon. Jet meant linear time, the kind that ends, the finite span from birth to death. These weren't poetic concepts. They were functional categories embedded in their calendar systems, their religious cycles, their entire astronomical observation apparatus. Time for them had multiple dimensions, multiple modes of existence. Look at their civil calendar. 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days added at the end. This calendar was extraordinarily accurate and predates the Roman calendar that eventually became our modern system. But they didn't stop there. They also maintained a completely separate lunar calendar for religious purposes, tracking the phases of the moon with precision necessary for ritual timing. And they had a third calendar, a stellar calendar based on the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, whose annual reappearance signaled the coming Nile flood. Managing 3 different calendar systems simultaneously, keeping them all accurate, reconciling their divergences, required mathematical sophistication that most ancient cultures never approached. It required understanding that different celestial cycles operate on different timescales, and that tracking all of them provides a more complete picture of cosmic mechanics than any single system could. They weren't just measuring days. They were mapping the movements of Earth, Moon, and stars in relation to each other across vast stretches of time. The deeper mystery emerges when you ask why they needed such precision. Egyptian texts reference the Sothic cycle, a period of 1,460 years, after which their civil calendar and stellar calendar would realign. Think about that. They were tracking celestial mechanics on timescales spanning dozens of generations, maintaining records across centuries, ensuring continuity of knowledge through political upheavals, invasions, famines, everything that destroys civilizations. Why? What made this multi-generational project worth the extraordinary effort? The texts hint at answers that make modern historians uncomfortable. They believed time itself was cyclical, that great ages came and went, that the stars revealed when these cosmic transitions would occur. They spoke of previous ages, previous versions of their civilization, catastrophes that reset everything. Were these just myths, or were they recording actual history, preserving memories of events so ancient that only their astronomical records could date them accurately? Here's what makes it stranger. The Egyptians appear to have understood the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis causing the background stars to shift positions over 26,000 years. This phenomenon wasn't officially discovered by Western science until Hipparchus in the 2nd century before Christ. Yet Egyptian monuments and texts suggest they knew about it much earlier. The Sphinx faces due east, aligned to the equinox sunrise, but geological weathering on its body suggests it might be far older than traditionally dated, possibly carved when a different constellation rose in the east, marking a different age entirely. Their texts speak openly about it. Previous kingdoms, previous versions of civilization, cosmic catastrophes that ended worlds and began new ones. Modern science confirms that Earth does experience periodic catastrophes, asteroid impacts, climate shifts, magnetic pole reversals, ice ages that bury continents under miles of frozen water. These aren't mythical events, they're geological facts. Did the Egyptians have records of previous catastrophes? Were they tracking cycles to predict when the next one would arrive? They didn't just measure time. They mapped it across tens of thousands of years, tracking patterns that wouldn't complete for hundreds of generations. They created systems designed to preserve knowledge across catastrophes, ensuring that whoever survived would have the information needed to rebuild and remember. What event were they preparing for? Did they know when it would happen again? And did they succeed in encoding warnings that we're only now learning to read? If the Egyptians understood cosmic cycles and tracked time on scales of millennia, they must have been preserving this knowledge deliberately, encoding it into something permanent, enough to survive whatever they feared was coming. The most famous mystery of all might hold the answer. The official story about the pyramids is simple. Pharaohs built them as tombs, as monuments to their power, as stairways to the afterlife. This explanation satisfies most questions and aligns with the evidence of burial chambers and funerary texts. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the mathematical precision, the astronomical alignments, the encoded knowledge that has nothing to do with death and everything to do with cosmic understanding. The Great Pyramid of Giza sits on a base covering 13 acres, forming a near-perfect square with sides aligned to true north, south, east, and west, within 1/15 of a degree. That level of accuracy isn't accidental. The ratio of its height to its base perimeter equals the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference. 2 pi, expressed in stone, built by people who supposedly didn't know advanced mathematics. The pyramid's latitude, measured in degrees, matches the speed of light measured in meters per second, 29.9792458. The same number, appearing in both location and universal constant. These correlations disturb the clean narrative. No Egyptian text explicitly explains them. No papyrus contains equations proving they understood these relationships. Yet there they are, built into millions of tons of limestone and granite, positioned with accuracy that shouldn't have been achievable with copper tools and rope. Either it's the most extraordinary coincidence in architectural history, or the pyramids encode knowledge that was never written down because it was too important to trust to documents that could burn. The 3 main pyramids of Giza align with Orion's belt, the 3 stars that Egyptians associated with Osiris and the afterlife. But the alignment isn't perfect for 2,500 years before Christ, when the pyramids were supposedly built. It's perfect for approximately 10,500 years before Christ. This raises questions that archaeology struggles to answer. Were the pyramids positioned based on astronomical observations from an era before Egyptian civilization officially existed? Did they have records, star maps, knowledge inherited from something even older? The internal architecture deepens the mystery. The king's chamber contains granite blocks weighing up to 70 tons, transported from quarries 500 miles away, lifted 200 feet off the ground, and fitted together with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. The precision exceeds what most modern construction achieves. Shafts extend from these chambers at specific angles, pointing to specific stars. The southern shaft from the King's Chamber aligns perfectly with Al-Nitak in Orion's belt. The northern shaft points to Alpha Draconis. These weren't ventilation shafts, they were sightlines, astronomical instruments built into solid stone. The pyramids weren't just tombs, they were mathematical puzzles, astronomical calculators, geographic markers, encoding fundamental knowledge about Earth's shape and humanity's place in the cosmos. In a civilization obsessed with eternal life, perhaps the pyramids represented the ultimate form of immortality, not preserving bodies, but preserving knowledge, creating monuments that would survive even if every text burned, every priest died, every memory faded, building messages that could only be decoded by future generations, intelligent enough to measure them, align them, understand what the angles and ratios and positions were trying to communicate across millennia. They encoded the speed of light in latitude. They built pi into architecture. They aligned chambers to stars with precision, requiring understanding of Earth's rotation and celestial mechanics. They transported impossible weights across impossible distances and assembled them with impossible accuracy. The question isn't just how they did it with primitive tools. The question is why they invested such extraordinary effort into encoding knowledge into permanent form. What message were they sending to the future? What knowledge did they consider so vital that it needed to be carved in stone, built into monuments designed to outlast empires, encoded in mathematics that transcends language? The pyramids stand as proof that the Egyptians knew something worth preserving forever. And perhaps we're only beginning to understand what they were trying to tell us. Imagine lying on a stone table in ancient Egypt, fully conscious, while a physician prepares to operate on your skull. He holds a bronze knife, sharpened to a razor edge, despite the metal's softness. He's about to perform trepanation, drilling a hole through your skull bone to relieve pressure on your brain. There's no anesthesia as we know it, though you've been given wine mixed with herbs that dull the pain without eliminating it entirely. The physician works with steady hands, cutting through skin, scraping away bone fragments, exposing the membrane beneath without piercing it. And here's the extraordinary part. You'll probably survive. We know this because archaeologists have found skulls with healed trepanation sites, not just one or two anomalies, but dozens of examples showing clear evidence that patients lived weeks, months, sometimes years after the procedure. The bone had regrown around the surgical opening. The person walked away, functioned, continued their life. This wasn't experimental butchery. This was successful brain surgery, performed over 3,000 years ago, with tools that seem impossibly primitive by modern standards. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated to around 1600 years before Christ, but copying knowledge even older, describes 48 surgical cases with clinical precision that mirrors modern medical documentation. Each case follows a systematic format: examination, diagnosis, prognosis, treatment. The text describes skull fractures, spinal cord injuries, dislocated shoulders, broken bones. It explains how to examine patients, what symptoms indicate what injuries, which conditions are treatable, and which are hopeless. The language is direct, practical, empirical. There's no mysticism here, no appeals to gods, just medicine. They performed procedures that wouldn't be successfully replicated in Europe until the 19th century. Cataract removal, extracting the clouded lens from the eye with bronze needles, setting compound fractures with wooden splints and linen bandages soaked in resin that hardened into casts. Circumcisions performed on both males and females, suturing wounds with thread made from animal sinew or plant fibers. Even attempting to remove tumors when they were accessible and operable, these weren't desperate last measures. These were standard medical procedures with established protocols. But how did they achieve acceptable survival rates with bronze instruments? Bronze is soft compared to surgical steel. It dulls quickly, bends under pressure, can't hold the fine edge that modern surgery requires. Yet Egyptian physicians developed techniques for maintaining their tools, sharpening methods that kept blades functional for delicate operations. They understood infection control before germ theory existed, using natron as an antiseptic, honey as an antibacterial agent, and various plant extracts that modern laboratory analysis has confirmed possess genuine antimicrobial properties. The deeper mystery emerges when you read what they knew about the human body. Egyptian medical texts describe diabetes, recognizing excessive thirst and frequent urination as diagnostic symptoms. They performed pregnancy tests that modern replication studies have shown were surprisingly accurate. They understood that the heart was central to the circulatory system, describing vessels that carried blood, air, and fluids throughout the body. This knowledge wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until William Harvey published his work on circulation in 1628, nearly 3,000 years later. How did they know these things? Through mummification. Every preserved body represented an autopsy, a dissection, an opportunity to observe internal structures with methodical attention. Over thousands of years, processing tens of thousands of bodies, knowledge accumulated. The priest-physicians who prepared the dead also treated the living, and each corpse taught them something about anatomy, about what organs did, about how the body worked. But this knowledge was restricted, kept within the houses of life where physicians trained. When Roman Egypt fell, when the temples closed, when the priesthood dispersed, the knowledge died with them. They could remove a brain through the nose, stitch arteries, set compound fractures, all with bronze tools and herbal medicines. Then, for 1,500 years, Europe forgot how. Medieval European physicians used leeches and prayers, while their predecessors had used scalpels and systematic observation. What else did we lose when their physicians disappeared? What techniques, what understanding, what accumulated clinical wisdom vanished because it was never written in languages that survived? The Ebers Papyrus stretches 20 meters long when fully unrolled, a scroll containing over 800 medical remedies for conditions ranging from headaches to heart disease, from snake bites to digestive complaints. What makes this pharmaceutical catalogue extraordinary isn't just its size, but its specificity. Each recipe includes precise measurements, detailed preparation instructions, and clear administration methods. Oral, topical, suppository, inhalation. The Egyptians weren't recording folk remedies passed down through vague tradition. They were documenting a sophisticated pharmaceutical system, refined through generations of empirical testing. Look at what they used. Willow bark for pain relief, which contains salicylic acid, the chemical basis for aspirin. Moldy bread applied to wounds, containing naturally occurring penicillin compounds that prevented bacterial infection. Castor oil as a laxative, still used today for the exact same purpose. Copper compounds in eye medicines that modern analysis confirms have genuine antimicrobial properties effective against bacterial conjunctivitis. These weren't lucky guesses. These were treatments that worked, proven through centuries of clinical application, preserved because they produced consistent results. The sophistication deepens when you examine their combination therapies. Many Egyptian remedies mixed multiple ingredients, what modern medicine calls polypharmacy. Recent pharmaceutical research suggests these combinations were often more effective than single compounds because they addressed multiple aspects of illness simultaneously. One treatment might contain an analgesic plant extract, an anti-inflammatory mineral compound, and an antimicrobial agent derived from tree resin. The Egyptians understood synergistic effects, knew that certain substances worked better together than separately, figured this out through methodical observation centuries before biochemistry could explain the mechanisms. But here's where it gets confusing for modern researchers. Egyptian medical texts often include spells, incantations, magical formulas, alongside the practical pharmaceutical recipes. For centuries, scholars dismissed these elements as primitive superstition contaminating otherwise rational medicine. But recent analysis suggests something more nuanced. The Egyptians integrated the psychological component of healing into their treatments. They understood that a patient's mental state affected physical recovery, that belief and expectation influenced outcomes. What we call the placebo effect, or psychosomatic medicine, was deliberately employed alongside active pharmaceutical compounds. They treated the whole person, not just the disease. Modern laboratories have actually tested some ancient Egyptian remedies, and the results are unsettling for conventional medical history. One study examined an Egyptian eye treatment containing copper salts, honey, and specific plant extracts. They tested it against modern antibiotics for treating bacterial eye infections. The ancient Egyptian formula performed better against certain resistant bacterial strains. Not just comparably, better. This raises uncomfortable questions. How many other treatments did they perfect that we've dismissed as primitive? What pharmaceutical knowledge did we lose because it was encoded in religious language we couldn't decode? The tragedy extends beyond lost recipes. The Egyptians had access to plants that may no longer exist, or whose medicinal properties we haven't identified. They used natural compounds from the Nile ecosystem that has fundamentally changed over 4,000 years. Plants that grew wild in their marshlands might be extinct now. Animals they harvested compounds from might have vanished. The pharmaceutical landscape they worked with was different from ours, and we can't fully recreate their treatments even when we have the recipes because we don't have the same raw materials. Consider what was lost. The houses of life, where physician priests trained, maintained gardens of medicinal plants, living libraries of botanical knowledge. Apprentice physicians spent years learning to identify hundreds of plant species, memorizing which parts to harvest, when to harvest them, how to prepare them. That knowledge was transmitted orally, person to person, generation to generation. When the houses of life closed, when the priesthood ended, when the last trained physicians died, the understanding died with them. We have their recipes, but we're missing the context, the accumulated wisdom that made those recipes useful. Their medicines worked. Modern labs have proven it. But we only have fragments of their formulas, pieces of a comprehensive pharmaceutical system. How many cures died with them? How many treatments did they perfect over millennia that we're still trying to rediscover? The answers are buried in papyri we haven't translated, encoded in temple inscriptions we haven't decoded, lost in the silence of extinct knowledge systems we barely understand existed. Egyptian physicians didn't just treat diseases, they treated people. This distinction matters more than it might seem. When a patient came to them complaining of headaches, they didn't just prescribe pain medicine. They asked about sleep, about stress, about family relationships, about emotional state. They understood that the physical symptom was just one manifestation of a larger imbalance, and treating the symptom without addressing the underlying cause was pointless medicine. Their training reflected this comprehensive approach. Physicians studied in the houses of life for years, learning not just anatomy and pharmacology, but also psychology, philosophy, and theology. They were doctors, priests, and counselors simultaneously, because the Egyptians recognized no fundamental separation between these roles. The body, mind, and spirit weren't distinct entities to be treated separately. They were interconnected aspects of a single, unified person. Healing required addressing all three. Egyptian medical texts describe treating what we'd recognize as depression and anxiety. Their methods included talk therapy, with priests serving as counselors who listened to patients describe their troubles and helped them process difficult emotions. Dream interpretation, which modern psychology would call accessing the subconscious mind. Music therapy, with specific instruments and rhythms prescribed for specific mental conditions. Aromatic treatments using frankincense, myrrh, and other fragrant compounds to alter mood and mental state. These weren't alternatives to physical medicine. They were integrated components of a comprehensive healthcare system. The concept they called Heka is usually translated as magic, but that translation misleads. Heka meant something closer to activation of life force, the deliberate manipulation of the energy that animates living things. Physicians believed illness occurred when this life force became blocked, weakened, or imbalanced. Treatment aimed to restore balance through multiple channels simultaneously. Physical interventions like medicine and surgery addressed the body. Counseling and suggestion addressed the mind. Ritual and community support addressed emotional needs. Prayer and offerings addressed spiritual dimensions. Strip away the religious language, and you're left with what modern medicine calls holistic health, integrative medicine, the biopsychosocial model. Modern research keeps validating Egyptian intuitions. We now know that chronic stress suppresses immune function, exactly as they observed when they noted that mental distress led to physical illness. We've discovered that gut bacteria influence mood and cognition, which explains why they used fermented foods and probiotics in treating mental conditions. We've proven that controlled breathing techniques alter heart rate variability and stress hormones, which they incorporated into healing rituals. We've confirmed that social connection and community support significantly impact recovery outcomes, which they emphasized through family involvement in healing processes. The Egyptians didn't understand biochemical mechanisms. They couldn't explain neurotransmitters or immune cascades or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. But they observed the patterns. They saw that mental state affected physical health. They noticed that isolated patients recovered more slowly than patients surrounded by family. They recognized that breathing exercises calmed anxious people. They built an entire medical system around these observations, and it worked. Then it was forgotten, not because it failed, but because it challenged philosophical frameworks that emerged later. Christian authorities rejected Egyptian medical practices as pagan. The holistic approach was abandoned in favor of separating body and soul, treating physical ailments while ignoring mental and emotional factors. Medieval European medicine regressed, losing sophisticated knowledge that had existed for millennia. It took Western medicine 2,000 years to circle back around to understanding what the Egyptians took for granted. You cannot treat the body without addressing the mind, cannot heal the mind without caring for the body. We have fragments of their medical texts now, pieces recovered from tombs and temple ruins. We can read their prescriptions, their surgical procedures, their diagnostic criteria, but we're missing the context that made those texts useful. The clinical training, the apprenticeship system, the accumulated experience of thousands of physicians over thousands of years. The knowledge survived, but the understanding didn't. We're only now rediscovering what they never forgot. Walk into the Serapeum of Saqqara, and you'll find yourself in underground tunnels lined with massive granite boxes. Each one weighs up to 100 tons. Each one was carved from a single block of solid granite. Each one has internal corners forming perfect 90-degree angles. And each surface is polished to what engineers call optical flatness, meaning the deviation across the entire surface measures in microns, the width of a human hair. These aren't decorative objects. These are manufactured artifacts with tolerances that suggest purpose, function, engineering intent that we can measure but not explain. Granite ranks 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. It's one of the toughest stones to work, resistant to cutting, grinding, and shaping. The standard explanation says Egyptians used copper tools with sand as an abrasive to cut granite. But when modern researchers actually try this method, they produce rough, uneven cuts that look nothing like the precision found in Egyptian stonework. The king's chamber in the Great Pyramid contains a granite sarcophagus cut from a solid block, hollowed out with perfect internal corners, polished to a mirror finish. Engineers have calculated that achieving this with bronze tools and sand should require rubbing continuously for approximately 500 years per surface. Yet Egypt produced thousands of similar artifacts across just a few centuries. Consider the unfinished obelisk at Aswan. If completed, it would have weighed 1,200 tons. It was carved directly from bedrock, separated from the surrounding stone by trenches that show no evidence of the massive infrastructure required to support workers cutting that deep. The precision-cut blocks at the Osirion in Abydos weigh over 100 tons each, and fit together with joints so thin you can't slide paper between them. The granite statues at Karnak show tool marks that suggest rotary cutting, circular grooves indicating some form of advanced drilling or sawing technology that shouldn't exist in the Bronze Age. Modern engineers who attempt to recreate Egyptian stonework using proposed ancient methods arrive at the same conclusion. It's theoretically possible but practically improbable given the time available, the quantity produced, and the consistency of results across thousands of artifacts. One research team spent months trying to drill a hole through granite using copper tubes and sand. They achieved penetration rates far slower than what's evident in Egyptian quarries. The spiral grooves in ancient drill cores suggest rotational speeds and pressure that copper simply cannot sustain without shattering or deforming. So what were they using? Some researchers propose the Egyptians possessed copper hardening techniques that modern metallurgy hasn't duplicated. Others suggest imported abrasives like corundum that would cut granite more effectively than sand, but don't appear in Egyptian geological surveys. More controversially, some theorize unknown cutting technologies, sound frequencies that weaken molecular bonds in stone, chemical compounds that temporarily soften granite. Ancient texts reference spells for working stone. What if these weren't mystical incantations, but coded instructions for technical processes we no longer understand? The pattern gets stranger when you examine chronology. The older structures often show superior precision. The Great Pyramid's construction blocks are more accurately cut than later pyramids. The earliest granite work is frequently the finest. This inverts everything we expect about technological progress. Skills should improve over time, yet Egyptian stoneworking appears to have peaked early and then degraded, as if they inherited advanced techniques that gradually deteriorated as knowledge was lost, or as crucial resources became scarcer, or as the experts who understood the full process died without successfully transmitting their expertise. We can analyze the stone. We can measure the precision down to microns. We can replicate these tolerances today using laser-guided CNC machines, diamond-tipped tools, and computer-controlled cutting systems. They did it with what we believe were copper chisels, sand, and rope. Either our understanding of their tools is fundamentally wrong, or the actual tools they used are missing from the archaeological record. Either they possessed techniques we've lost, or they had access to technology we haven't found evidence for. The stones remain polished and precise, waiting to reveal how hands that lived 4,000 years ago achieved what modern engineers struggle to duplicate. Walk into a newly opened Egyptian tomb, and the colors will shock you. Blues so brilliant they seem to glow in the darkness. Reds that look wet, as if the paint was applied yesterday. Yellows that shine like gold leaf catching light. These pigments have survived 4,000 years, exposed to temperature fluctuations, humidity changes, and the slow chemical processes that destroy most colorants within decades. This isn't lucky preservation. This is chemical engineering that created molecular structures so stable that time cannot erase them. Egyptian blue might be humanity's greatest chemical achievement that nobody remembers. First synthesized around 3,200 years before Christ, this pigment required heating limestone, sand, and copper-containing minerals to approximately 850 to 950 degrees Celsius, holding that precise temperature long enough for chemical transformation, then cooling at controlled rates. The result is calcium copper silicate, a crystalline compound that absorbs red light and emits infrared radiation. Modern analysis reveals optical properties. Researchers are only now exploring for applications in medical imaging and telecommunications. They created nanotechnology before we had microscopes to see what we were making. But Egyptian blue was just one color in a complete palette. They produced whites from calcium compounds, blacks from soot and manganese dioxide, reds from iron oxide and cinnabar, yellows from arsenic sulfide and iron ochre, greens from malachite, and later from mixing blue and yellow. What's remarkable isn't the diversity, but the stability. Modern synthetic pigments often fade within 50 to 100 years when exposed to ultraviolet light. Museum conservators fight constant battles against color degradation. Egyptian pigments painted on tomb walls survive millennia with vibrancy that makes them look contemporary. How did they do it? How did they determine reaction temperatures without thermometers? How did they achieve consistency across millions of painted surfaces in hundreds of tombs, temples, and monuments? How did they know which binding mediums to use with which pigments? Egg white for some colors, plant gums for others, beeswax for specific applications. These weren't simple recipes passed down through oral tradition. These were sophisticated chemical processes requiring understanding of materials science, thermal dynamics, molecular bonding, and long-term stability testing. Recent spectroscopic analysis reveals something even stranger. Some Egyptian pigments contain trace elements and compounds that shouldn't be there according to our reconstruction of their manufacturing processes. Either they had access to materials we don't know about, sourced from locations we haven't identified, or they performed chemical transformations we don't understand, using techniques that left no written record. Some pigment samples show particles structured at nanometer scales that shouldn't be achievable without electron microscopes and modern fabrication equipment. They were manipulating matter at molecular levels through empirical methods we cannot replicate. The textile dyes present an even deeper mystery. Egyptians wore linen dyed with colors that survive in tomb paintings and mummy wrappings. Textile dyes are notoriously unstable. Even modern synthetic dyes fade quickly with washing and light exposure. Egyptian dyed fabrics remain colored after 3,000 years. Modern chemists, analyzing these ancient textiles, can identify the plant sources through molecular analysis. They know which flowers, roots, and leaves provided the base materials, but knowing the ingredients doesn't reveal the process. They cannot replicate the mordants, the fixatives, the specific sequences of treatment that made these dyes so color-fast. We know what the pigments are made of. We can analyze them down to atomic composition, but we don't know how they were made. The detailed procedures, the working knowledge that came from generations of empirical experimentation, vanished when the tradition ended. Medieval painters tried to recreate Egyptian blue and failed. The recipe was lost. It wasn't successfully synthesized again until the 19th century, and even modern production doesn't perfectly match ancient samples in optical properties and stability. The colors in their tombs look fresh enough to be touched wet. Our synthetic paints fade within decades, requiring constant conservation and restoration. They created pigments with molecular structures so stable that 4 millennia of chemical exposure barely affects them. They achieved nanotechnology through methods we're still trying to understand. How many chemical processes did they master that we've lost? How many formulas died with the last generation of temple craftsmen who never wrote down what their hands knew? The colors remain, brilliant and impossible, testifying to knowledge we can analyze but cannot duplicate. The pyramid complex at Giza contains copper piping, not crude tubes hammered from sheet metal, precisely engineered pipes with standardized dimensions running through the structure. Analysis reveals they were created through drawing processes, pulling metal through dies to create consistent tubing with uniform wall thickness. This technique wasn't supposed to exist until the Industrial Revolution, yet here it is, installed in construction projects dating to 2,500 years before Christ. The pipes show no evidence of manufacturing defects, no variations in diameter, no irregularities that would indicate hand fabrication. They look like modern plumbing components. Egyptian bronze work reveals even deeper sophistication. They created alloys optimized for specific purposes, hard bronze for tools and weapons, requiring higher tin content and specific heat treatment, softer bronze for sculpture and decorative work, allowing detailed casting and finishing, specialized formulas for different applications, with precisely controlled ratios of copper, tin, arsenic, and lead. Analysis of ancient bronze artifacts shows they understood work hardening, the process where hammering metal increases its strength. They understood annealing, heating metal to specific temperatures to relieve stress and restore workability. They created surface treatments that resisted corrosion so effectively that some bronze objects recovered from tombs show almost no degradation after 3,000 years. Modern metallurgy cannot fully explain this preservation. Bronze corrodes. It forms patina, loses structural integrity, crumbles under environmental exposure. Yet Egyptian bronze remains intact, suggesting protective coatings or alloy compositions we don't understand. Some artifacts show surface layers that shouldn't exist according to our knowledge of ancient chemistry. Either they applied compounds we haven't identified, or the bronze itself contains trace elements that create self-protecting surfaces through processes we haven't replicated. The controversial evidence emerges from quarry sites and tool marks. Copper chisels found at construction locations that analysis suggests were hardened beyond what should be achievable with Bronze Age techniques. Drill cores extracted from granite showing spiral grooves indicating rotational speeds that copper shouldn't sustain without destroying the tool. Saw marks in stone that some engineers argue require blade materials harder than copper or bronze. The traditional explanations don't match the physical evidence. Either the tools were different from what we've found, or the techniques were more sophisticated than we understand. Then there are the Dendera reliefs. Mainstream archaeology interprets them as symbolic religious imagery, showing mythological scenes. But some researchers see something else. Objects resembling light bulbs connected to devices that could be power sources. Figures holding what look like electrical insulators. Structures similar to vacuum tubes or early electrical equipment. Could ancient Egyptians have possessed knowledge of electrochemistry? The Baghdad battery from Mesopotamia proves that ancient Near Eastern cultures had primitive electrical devices. If neighboring regions had batteries, what technology did Egypt possess that we haven't found or recognized? Egyptian texts reference D-jade pillars and objects with properties that sound energetic or electrical in nature. The jade symbol appears everywhere in Egyptian art, traditionally interpreted as representing stability and the backbone of Osiris. but its shape resembles an insulator column, a conductor support, a component from electrical engineering. Could there be layered meaning? Religious symbolism, encoding functional technical knowledge that served dual purposes? A pattern emerges across Egyptian technology. They possessed isolated advanced capabilities without the full industrial infrastructure we'd expect to support them. Precision pipes without evidence of pipe-making facilities. Advanced bronze without extensive foundries. Sophisticated stone cutting without the tool workshops that should exist. Two explanations present themselves. Either they had comprehensive technical systems using biodegradable materials like wood and rope that haven't survived in the archaeological record, or they inherited specific knowledge from an earlier source and maintained techniques without fully understanding underlying principles. The tragedy is this. Much of Egyptian metalwork was melted down by later civilizations for valuable copper and bronze. We've lost thousands of artifacts that might have revealed their capabilities. The surviving examples are those buried, lost, or considered too sacred to destroy. We're judging Egyptian metallurgy from fragments that survived only by accident, by being hidden away from the recycling that claimed everything else. They created copper pipes, matching modern standards, bronze that resists corrosion, tools that cut granite without adequate explanation. And then, metal became currency, melted down into coins and weapons, lost forever. How much evidence of their true capabilities did we unknowingly destroy? The Rosetta Stone unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs in 1822. Jean-François Champollion stared at the parallel texts carved in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic script until the pattern emerged. Sound values, phonetic symbols. The breakthrough that let us read what had been silent for 14 centuries. But reading symbols isn't the same as understanding what they meant to the people who carved them. We can translate Egyptian now. We can render their sentences into English, French, German. But translation is just the beginning of comprehension. Ancient Egypt didn't have one writing system. It had three, operating simultaneously for thousands of years. Hieroglyphic was sacred, carved writing, reserved for temple walls, tomb inscriptions, and monuments meant to last forever. Hieratic was priestly cursive, flowing script used for religious texts and administrative records. Demotic was common writing, the script of merchants and everyday correspondence. These weren't just different styles of the same language. They were access control mechanisms. A person literate in Demotic couldn't necessarily read hieratic. Someone trained in hieratic might lack the specialized knowledge to interpret hieroglyphs properly. Knowledge was compartmentalized by script itself, ensuring that information stayed within appropriate circles. The complexity goes deeper when you examine how hieroglyphs actually function. They're not purely phonetic like alphabets that represent sounds. They're not purely ideographic like some Chinese characters that represent whole concepts. They're both simultaneously. A single hieroglyph can be read as a sound, as a complete word, or as an abstract concept, depending on context and position. Some symbols function as determinatives, markers that carry no sound value but clarify meaning, like punctuation that changes interpretation. This creates layers, the surface meaning that any literate person could extract, and deeper meanings accessible only to those trained in symbolic interpretation, who understood references and double meanings that weren't explicitly written. Temple inscriptions contain what scholars call cryptographic hieroglyphs, deliberate symbolic puzzles using rare characters, rebuses, multi-layered meanings designed to obscure rather than clarify. These weren't meant for quick reading. They were meant for contemplation, study, and meditation. Modern Egyptologists can translate them grammatically, determining subject and verb and object. But the intended meaning often eludes us because the symbolic keys were transmitted orally, teacher to student, never written down. It's like reading poetry in a foreign language. You understand the words, but miss the cultural resonance, the allusions, the references to context that no longer exists. Egyptian wasn't even a single language across time. It evolved over 3,000 years, from Old Egyptian to Middle Egyptian to Late Egyptian to Coptic. Each period had different vocabulary, different grammar, different conventions. Texts written in different eras require different linguistic knowledge to translate accurately. But the complication intensifies because religious texts were often deliberately written in archaic language, even in later periods. Priests used Old Egyptian or Middle Egyptian for sacred inscriptions long after those forms had become ancient and partially mysterious, even to contemporary Egyptians. Imagine modern religious texts written entirely in Old English, technically readable to specialists, but requiring years of study to interpret correctly. When Egypt fell, language loss compounded across generations. Coptic survived into the medieval period, the last stage of Egyptian written in Greek letters, but the connection to older Egyptian was already weakening. By the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, hieroglyphs were completely forgotten. The last temple priests who could read them died, taking their knowledge into graves, scattered across a land now controlled by people who saw those symbols as meaningless decoration. For 1400 years, hieroglyphs remained beautiful patterns whose meaning was utterly lost. When Champollion deciphered them, he gave us back the words, but not the full understanding. We can read their words now. We can translate their sentences, render them into modern languages, publish them in academic journals. But can we understand what they truly meant? When symbols carry three meanings simultaneously, and priests spent lifetimes learning to decode them, how much are we still missing in translation? Stand inside the Pyramid of Anas at Saqqara and look up. The walls are covered with columns of hieroglyphs, stretching across stone surfaces, dense text carved and painted in the darkness. These are the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, dating to 2400 years before Christ. They're spells, supposedly, designed to guide the pharaoh's soul through the afterlife, to help him navigate dangers and achieve immortality among the stars. But read them carefully, and something stranger emerges. Precise geographical descriptions, astronomical references, mathematical sequences, instructions that sound as technological as they do mystical. Spell 273 describes the deceased, crossing a lake using a ferry, providing navigational instructions with cardinal directions and specific star positions for orientation. Is this purely metaphorical journey through some spiritual realm? Or does it preserve actual geographic knowledge encoded in religious language, describing real locations using afterlife narrative as cover? Spell 669 describes a ladder to the sky constructed from specific materials in specific proportions, detailed enough to sound like engineering instructions disguised as theological symbolism. When we approach these texts as potentially multi-layered, containing religious meaning and practical information simultaneously, new interpretations become possible. Ancient cultures frequently encoded sensitive knowledge in religious frameworks. The Egyptian priesthood passed this technique to Greek mystery religions, where practical astronomy was taught as astrology, chemistry as alchemy, psychology as theology. Information too valuable or dangerous for public access was wrapped in mythological narratives that initiates learn to decode at progressively deeper levels. The literal religious story for beginners, symbolic meanings for intermediate students, practical encoded knowledge for masters who proved their discretion and understanding. Could the pyramid texts and Book of the Dead represent this same tradition? Sacred scriptures serving multiple purposes depending on the reader's level of initiation? Modern researchers examining these texts beyond literal translation find curious patterns. Mathematical sequences in spell numbering that appear deliberately structured, repeated phrases that might function as mnemonic devices, references to ceremonies involving specific tools and substances that sound like medical or metallurgical procedures clothed in ritual language. The Osiris myth itself, the central narrative of death, dismemberment, and resurrection, has been interpreted as allegory for agricultural cycles, astronomical movements, and alchemical transformation processes. Multiple meanings layered into single narratives. Compare Egyptian texts to other ancient wisdom traditions. The Vedas, the Kabbalah, Hermetic writings, all share a pattern of encoding practical knowledge in religious or mystical language. And these traditions acknowledge Egyptian influence. Hermetic philosophy explicitly claims Egyptian origin, stating that Hermes Trismegistus, identified with the Egyptian god Thoth, revealed secrets to Greek initiates. What if this wasn't legend, but history? What if Egyptian priests did transmit knowledge to foreign students, but only in encoded form that required oral instruction to properly decode? The texts alone were incomplete without the decoder ring, the interpretive key passed teacher to student through demonstration and explanation. The tragedy is that we have the texts, but lack the tradition that taught people how to read them. It's like possessing an encrypted file without the password. We see the symbols, translate the words, parse the grammar, but cannot access deeper layers of content. Some researchers believe the symbolic keys survived in distorted forms through Gnosticism, Hermeticism, alchemy, Freemasonry. But the transmission was so fragmented, so corrupted across centuries of persecution and secrecy, that connecting these modern traditions back to original Egyptian meanings is nearly impossible. Did Egyptian priests deliberately encode knowledge in religious language knowing their civilization would eventually fall? Were these texts designed to survive as scripture, preserving information that future generations might eventually learn to decode? Or are we seeing patterns that don't exist, reading significance into texts that really were just mythology, just poetry, just religious imagination? The answer might depend on which level of meaning you can access. Surface readers see mythology. Trained initiates might have seen something else entirely. They wrote thousands of spells across pyramid walls and papyrus scrolls. We translated them as mythology, catalogued them as religious literature, analyzed them as cultural artifacts. But what if the myths were code? What if resurrection spells described actual processes we no longer recognize? If you wanted to communicate across thousands of years to people who don't speak your language, who don't share your culture, who might not even think the way you think, how would you do it? Words change, languages evolve and die. But images can transcend linguistic barriers. Proportions carry meaning independent of vocabulary. Geometric relationships encode information that mathematics can decode regardless of cultural context. The Egyptians appear to have understood this. They created a visual vocabulary that preserves knowledge in forms that survive translation. Take the Ankh symbol, the looped cross representing life. Its proportions aren't arbitrary. The loop's diameter, the cross's horizontal arms, the vertical stem they relate through mathematical ratios that appear throughout Egyptian art and architecture. Phi, the golden ratio. Pi, square roots. Are these aesthetic choices, or is mathematical knowledge being preserved in visual form? The Eye of Horus divides into fractions representing the 6 senses: 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/64. Together, they sum to 63 64ths, deliberately leaving 1/64th missing to represent what's beyond human perception. This symbol simultaneously depicts anatomy, encodes mathematical notation, and expresses philosophical concepts about the limits of knowledge. The concept might be called ideographic preservation, storing information in images rather than text. The periodic table could be represented as a symbolic diagram, conveying elemental relationships without words. Similarly, Egyptian temple reliefs might preserve astronomical, anatomical, or engineering knowledge in visual form that transcends language. The controversial helicopter hieroglyphs at Abydos are probably palimpsests, overlapping inscriptions from different periods, creating accidental, modern-looking shapes. But they raise a valid question. If Egyptians wanted to depict technologies or concepts they couldn't describe with existing vocabulary, how would they draw them? How do you illustrate something you understand but lack words for? Egyptian art follows strict rules. Figures facing left versus right carry meaning. Colors aren't decorative choices. Green signifies resurrection and vegetation. Black represents fertile Nile soil and rebirth. Blue indicates divinity. Red symbolizes chaos and the desert. Proportions follow precise canon. 18 squares for a standing human figure, with specific body parts at specific grid intersections. This isn't artistic preference or cultural style. This is standardization, suggesting visual rules encoded information. A properly trained Egyptian would read an image like text, extracting meaning from every proportional relationship, every color selection, every spatial arrangement. Sacred geometry appears consistently across Egyptian monuments. The golden ratio, pi, Pythagorean triples, astronomical alignments. These mathematical relationships go beyond structural necessity. The Temple of Luxor's floor plan encodes human body proportions at massive scale. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode Earth's measurements, hemisphere calculations, orbital relationships. If you didn't know these numbers, but could measure the structures accurately, you could reverse engineer the mathematical constants. Is this intentional? Were monuments designed as three-dimensional textbooks that would survive language death? Physical equations carved in stone? Modern researchers attempting to read Egyptian monuments as symbolic information storage discover encoded relationships. Column spacing, correlating to lunar cycles. Courtyard dimensions incorporating pi. Chamber sizes reflecting musical harmonics and mathematical series. Skeptics argue that we find patterns because human brains seek patterns. Given enough measurements from any complex structure, some will correlate to something. But advocates counter that the consistency across multiple sites, the repetition of specific ratios, the precision of alignments, suggests deliberate design rather than statistical inevitability. Egyptian symbols persist in modern use, despite most people not understanding their origins. The medical caduceus, pharmaceutical symbols, mystical traditions, currency designs. These images carried meaning 4,000 years ago and still resonate today, still communicate something that bypasses conscious analysis. Perhaps that's the point. Powerful symbols transcend translation, carrying information at unconscious levels that persist across cultures and millennia. The Egyptians created visual language that communicates even when we don't consciously comprehend it. Knowledge transmission that survives linguistic death. Every proportion was precise. Every color had meaning. Every symbol followed rules that took years to learn and lifetimes to master. If their monuments are books written in stone and mathematics, if their hieroglyphs are code requiring multiple keys to fully unlock, how much knowledge are we walking past without recognizing it? How many equations are we standing inside without realizing we're surrounded by information? The ancient Egyptians didn't separate science from spirituality. They saw them as different languages describing the same underlying reality. Their cosmology wasn't mythology designed to comfort people about forces they couldn't control. It was their physics, their psychology, their unified field theory explaining how everything works. And the principles they articulated thousands of years ago sound remarkably familiar to anyone who's studied modern physics, systems theory, or consciousness research. These principles survived through Hermetic philosophy, which traces its origins directly to Egyptian wisdom teachings attributed to Thoth. The principle of mentalism states that all is mind, that the universe is mental in nature. Before you dismiss this as mystical nonsense, consider quantum mechanics' observer effect, where consciousness appears to influence physical outcomes. Consider the growing body of research suggesting that mind might not be generated by matter, but might be fundamental to reality itself. The principle of correspondence teaches that patterns repeat across scales. As above, so below. As within, so without. This describes what modern mathematics calls fractal geometry, self-similarity across different magnitudes. The structure of atoms resembles the structure of solar systems. Neural networks mirror galaxy distributions. Patterns that work at one level replicate at others. The Egyptians observed this without microscopes or telescopes, recognizing through philosophical reasoning what we've confirmed through instrumentation. The principle of vibration holds that everything moves, nothing rests, all matter vibrates at different frequencies. Modern physics confirms this precisely. Atoms vibrate. Molecules oscillate. Even solid objects are energy vibrating slowly enough to appear stable. The difference between matter and energy is frequency. The Egyptians understood this conceptually 3,000 years before wave-particle duality was mathematically described. The principle of polarity states that everything has opposites, that extremes are identical in nature but different in degree. Particle physics discovered matter and antimatter, positive and negative charges, complementary forces throughout nature. Hot and cold are degrees of temperature. Love and hate are degrees of emotional intensity. The Egyptians recognized that opposites aren't separate things but different manifestations of the same spectrum. The principle of rhythm teaches that everything flows, rises and falls, advances and retreats. Wave functions, cyclic systems, pendulum swings, day and night, seasons, tides, heartbeats, brainwaves. Reality operates rhythmically at every scale. The Egyptians built entire calendar systems around this understanding, tracking cycles from daily to multimillennial. The principle of cause and effect is foundational to all science. Nothing happens by chance. Every effect has a cause. Every action produces reaction. Physics couldn't exist without this principle. Yet the Egyptians stated it as philosophical truth before experimental science developed methods to test it rigorously. The principle of gender recognizes masculine and feminine energies in everything, not limited to biological sex, but describing complementary forces throughout existence. Electromagnetic theory describes positive and negative charges. Chinese philosophy calls them yin and yang. Systems require complementary components to function. Creation emerges from interaction between opposing but compatible forces. Either these are astonishing coincidences, 7 lucky guesses that happen to describe physical reality accurately, or the Egyptians developed a philosophical framework that captured genuine truth through different methodology than modern science. They arrived at these principles through observation, meditation, contemplation, different path, similar destination. This suggests that truth isn't monopolized by any single approach. Rational empiricism discovers it through measurement and experimentation. Contemplative insight reaches it through direct perception and philosophical reasoning. The Egyptians had a concept they called ma'at, usually translated as truth or justice or cosmic order. But more accurately, ma'at meant the fundamental pattern underlying reality, the discoverable structure that makes existence coherent rather than chaotic. Ma'at wasn't a deity requiring worship. It was a principle requiring understanding. Pharaohs claimed to uphold Ma'at. Priests studied it. Individuals sought alignment with it. This resembles modern concepts of natural law, physical constants, emergent order in complex systems. These ideas didn't die with Egypt. Pythagoras studied in Egyptian temples and brought back mathematical mysticism. Plato's philosophy shows Egyptian influence. Early Christian theology absorbed Egyptian concepts through Hermeticism and Neoplatonism. The Egyptian understanding of reality was absorbed, transformed, transmitted through Western intellectual history, often unacknowledged but persistently influential. 3,000 years before quantum mechanics, they taught that reality is mental. Before wave theory, they knew everything vibrates. Before relativity, they understood time as flexible and cyclical. Lucky guesses, or different paths to the same truth about how reality actually functions. The Egyptians didn't believe you had a soul. They believed you were 9 different components operating together, each with distinct properties, each capable of independent existence after death. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was a sophisticated model of consciousness that modern psychology is slowly, reluctantly, rediscovering through different terminology. The cart was your physical body, the material form that decayed after death. The ka was your life force, your energetic double that sustained biological function. The ba was your personality, your individual consciousness, the part that experienced and remembered. The ark was your enlightened self, the unified consciousness achieved through spiritual development. The sahu was your spiritual body, the subtle form that could exist independent of physical matter. The Sekhem was your power, your vital energy. The Ab was your heart, considered the seat of consciousness and moral center. The Ren was your name, your identity that persisted as long as you were remembered. The Shuyet was your shadow, the unconscious aspects of self. Modern psychology confirms we're not unified selves, but multiple subsystems. The conscious mind, the unconscious, the ego, the id, the superego. Executive function, emotional processing, memory storage, different brain regions, handling different aspects of experience, sometimes in conflict with each other. The Egyptians described this complexity without neuroscience, recognizing through observation and introspection what brain scans now demonstrate physically. The Ka resembles what researchers call the biofield. The energy pattern some studies suggest surrounds living organisms. The Ba corresponds to what we call personality and individual consciousness. The arc represents what psychology calls self-actualization, enlightenment, integrated consciousness. And the Ab, the heart, which Egyptians considered the true center of consciousness rather than the brain, connects to modern research showing the heart has its own neural network, that it sends more signals to the brain than the brain sends to it. That emotional processing involves the heart in ways we're only beginning to understand. The famous weighing of the heart ceremony, depicted in tomb paintings, shows the deceased's heart balanced against Ma'at's feather of truth. Traditional interpretation says This is moral judgment, determining afterlife fate. Alternative interpretation suggests it's symbolic consciousness measurement, determining whether an individual achieved balance, wisdom, alignment with cosmic order. The heart, containing a record of all thoughts and actions, resembles modern understanding that experience physically alters neural structures, that memory leaves material traces, that consciousness isn't separate from matter but embedded in it. Egyptian mummification practices make sense through this framework. Preserving the cart maintained connection to the car. They removed the brain, considered unimportant, but carefully preserved the heart, considered essential. This reflects their understanding that consciousness wasn't solely neurological. Modern consciousness research increasingly questions strict materialism. The assumption that consciousness is purely brain-generated. Terminal lucidity, where dying patients with severe dementia suddenly become clear-minded hours before death, despite brain damage. Near-death experiences reporting consciousness during cardiac arrest when brain function is minimal. Quantum biology theories suggesting consciousness might involve processes not localized to neural tissue alone. The Egyptians believed components of the soul could recycle into new bodies, while other components persisted in the afterlife or merged with cosmic consciousness. This multi-layered model accommodates both reincarnation and survival of individual consciousness, concepts that seem contradictory in simpler soul models, but compatible if consciousness is composite. Research into children's past life memories, studied rigorously by psychiatrists like Ian Stevenson, documents cases where young children report verifiable details about deceased strangers they couldn't have known through normal means. Controversial evidence that some form of consciousness transfer between lives might occur, exactly what Egyptian soul models predicted. These concepts influenced later traditions. Gnostic Christianity's multiple spiritual bodies, Kabbalistic soul divisions, Hindu koshas, New Age energy bodies, all echo Egyptian frameworks. The understanding became foundational to Western esotericism, surviving in modified forms even as mainstream religion simplified to body-soul dualism. If consciousness is composite rather than unitary, then death becomes transition rather than ending. Different aspects of self have different fates. The body returns to earth, life force dissipates, personality might continue. Enlightened consciousness merges with universal mind. They didn't believe in one soul. They recognized 9 components. Modern psychology confirms we're multiple selves in one body. They knew this 4,000 years ago. The Egyptians spoke of knowledge that existed independent of books, accessible through consciousness rather than reading. They described what later traditions would call the Akashic records, though they used different names. The Hall of Records. The Duat's Wisdom Library. A cosmic repository where all events, all thoughts, all discoveries were preserved in some non-physical medium that trained minds could access directly. This sounds mystical until you consider how they claim to use it. Temple sleep, a practice where seekers would sleep in sacred chambers to receive insight. Priests reporting knowledge gained through dreams or visions that proved accurate. Initiation ceremonies designed to alter consciousness states and facilitate connection to universal mind. They treated this as natural, as technique rather than supernatural intervention. A method for accessing information not available to ordinary conscious awareness. Modern theories parallel these ancient concepts remarkably. Carl Jung's collective unconscious proposes that humans share inherited memory and archetypal knowledge at an unconscious level, explaining why similar symbols and myths appear across disconnected cultures. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance hypothesis suggests that forms and behaviors are shaped by fields containing memory from past similar systems, that nature has memory independent of genetic or learned transmission. Quantum consciousness theories propose consciousness might be a fundamental field that individual brains access rather than generate, similar to how radios receive rather than create radio waves. If cosmic memory is real, it explains anomalies. How did Egyptians know to track 26,000-year precession cycles? If previous civilizations observed them, and that knowledge entered the information field, Egyptian priest initiates practicing consciousness techniques could access it directly without archaeological evidence of transmission. This explains simultaneous discovery, where different researchers independently reach identical conclusions. It explains scientific insights arising in dreams, like Kekulé visualizing benzene's ring structure or mathematicians like Ramanujan, claiming formulas came through direct perception rather than derivation. Egyptian initiation practices specifically trained these access techniques. The mystery schools didn't just teach facts, they taught how to retrieve knowledge directly from the source. Meditation practices, fasting protocols, sensory deprivation, rhythmic chanting, temple chambers designed with specific acoustic properties that generated resonant frequencies affecting consciousness, all designed to alter brain states and facilitate connection to what they understood as universal mind. When these schools closed, systematic training disappeared. Fragments survived in esoteric traditions, but the complete methodology was lost. The evidence for such a knowledge field is circumstantial but intriguing. Identical symbols arising in cultures with no contact. Universal archetypes appearing across human psychology, regardless of cultural background. Instinctive knowledge in animals, migration routes and nest-building behaviors that aren't learned but somehow known. Human intuition that sometimes proves correct without logical foundation. These phenomena don't prove cosmic memory exists, but they're consistent with it, and they're difficult to explain through conventional models, assuming all knowledge must be individually learned or genetically inherited. The profound implication disturbs and excites in equal measure. If cosmic memory exists, then Egyptian knowledge isn't entirely lost. It persists in the information field, theoretically accessible to anyone who develops consciousness techniques to retrieve it. This is why mystery traditions claim to rediscover ancient knowledge rather than inventing it. They're accessing what was always there, what exists independent of physical records. Whether literally true or metaphorically useful, this framework explains how wisdom traditions preserve knowledge across millennia, despite language loss, cultural disruption, and institutional destruction. The techniques might be recoverable. Meditation research confirms that specific practices alter consciousness measurably, affecting brain activity in ways that correlate with reported subjective experiences of expanded awareness. Psychedelic research suggests certain substances facilitate access to information processing normally unavailable to conscious awareness. Modern neuroscience is beginning to map consciousness states that ancient traditions accessed through different methods. They claimed knowledge lived in a cosmic library, accessible through consciousness alone. Modern physics proposes information fields pervading reality. Psychologists document collective unconscious patterns. Quantum theories suggest non-local information transfer. What if they were describing the same phenomenon through different conceptual frameworks? What if the Hall of Records is real? The Egyptians had a word that modern translators render as magic, but that translation misses something crucial. Heka didn't mean supernatural intervention or illusion or fantasy. It meant the activation of Ka, the life force, through focused consciousness and proper technique. To the Egyptians, Heka was as natural as gravity or magnetism, a force that could be studied, understood, applied through systematic methods developed over generations. Priests and magicians were technicians working with consciousness-matter interactions, the way engineers work with structural forces. Egyptian magical practice involved specific components, each serving a function in the overall process. Words of power, phonetically structured to create particular effects through sound vibration and meaning. Precise timing, utilizing astrological and astronomical alignments when celestial influences made certain operations more effective. Physical objects like amulets, statues, and inscribed papyri, constructed from specific materials, believed to interact with subtle forces. Symbolic actions, gestures, and ritual movements that directed intention and energy. Altered consciousness states achieved through rhythmic drumming, chanting, controlled breathing, or psychoactive substances. This wasn't arbitrary superstition. Each element was deliberately chosen and combined according to principles they believed governed how consciousness affects physical reality. Modern parallels exist, though mainstream science remains cautious about them. The placebo effect demonstrates that belief alters physical outcomes measurably. Psychoneuroimmunology confirms that mental states affect immune function through documented biochemical pathways. Quantum mechanics observer effect shows that observation influences particle behavior at subatomic scales. Intention experiments, conducted by researchers like Dean Radin, document statistically significant effects of focused intention on random number generators and biological systems. While controversial and often rejected by materialist science, replicated results suggest consciousness might interact with physical systems in ways our current physics doesn't adequately explain. Egyptian Heka might represent ancient understanding of phenomena we're only beginning to investigate scientifically through different conceptual frameworks. Consider specific practices through this lens. The opening of the mouth ceremony involved touching a statue or mummy with ritual tools while reciting precise formulas. Traditional interpretation says this was purely symbolic, activating the spirit of the deceased through religious theatre. Alternative interpretation suggests it might involve genuine energy transfer, that properly trained practitioners could direct biofield energy or subtle forces through tools and intention to activate some aspect of the object that remained dormant without this intervention. Protective amulets were constructed from specific materials and consecrated through specific rituals. Was the protection entirely psychological, providing confidence that reduced stress and improved decision-making? Or did properly constructed amulets interact with human biofields or environmental energies in ways we don't fully understand? Tomb curses, inscribed with malevolent intent, pure deterrent through fear, or could focused negative intention embedded in inscribed materials create genuine psychological or energetic effects on those who violated the tombs? The crucial detail that separates Egyptian Heka from fantasy magic is this: it required proper state of consciousness and extensive training. It didn't work automatically like turning on a light switch. The practitioner needed years of development in concentration, visualization, emotional control, and energetic awareness. This resembles modern biofeedback and neurofeedback training, where consciousness learns to control typically autonomous processes like heart rate, blood pressure, brainwave patterns, immune responses. Egyptians perhaps understood this principle more broadly, recognizing that with sufficient training, consciousness could affect not just internal physiology, but external reality through mechanisms we haven't fully mapped. This knowledge was guarded not just for power monopoly, but because Heka was believed genuinely dangerous if misused. Incorrect application could harm the practitioner or others. This makes sense even in modern framework. If consciousness affects reality more directly than we typically acknowledge, then untrained minds affecting things unconsciously or carelessly would be problematic. The mystery schools didn't hide knowledge to control people. They ensured practitioners were psychologically stable and ethically prepared before teaching techniques that could be misused or backfire if applied incorrectly by unprepared minds. Most claimed magical effects can be explained through psychology, suggestion, coincidence, fraud. But rejecting all possibilities, because most are explainable risks missing genuine phenomena. Egyptian Heka warrants examination not because we should believe every magical claim, but because it represents systematic approaches to consciousness-matter interaction that might contain insights useful to modern consciousness research. They called it magic. They treated it as science. They trained for decades to use it properly. Modern researchers find consciousness affects physical systems in measurable ways. Were they studying the same phenomena through different frameworks? Picture yourself in an Egyptian temple at midnight. Darkness surrounds you except for oil lamps flickering against stone walls carved with hieroglyphs that seem to move in the uncertain light. Rhythmic drumming echoes through chambers, designed to amplify certain frequencies while dampening others. Priests chant in harmonic tones that resonate in your chest and skull. Incense smoke fills the space with compounds that alter perception subtly, compounds derived from plants whose effects were studied across generations. You've been fasting for days. Your neurotransmitter balance shifted, your consciousness more plastic and receptive. The ceremony is timed to specific astronomical alignments when celestial influences are believed most favorable. Every element is calibrated. Nothing is accidental. This is consciousness engineering. Rhythmic drumming at 4 to 7 Hz, the theta wave range associated with trance states, measurably alters brain activity. Modern EEG studies confirm that rhythmic auditory stimulation at these frequencies induces altered consciousness reliably. Egyptian priests understood this empirically, discovering through experimentation which rhythms produced which effects. Harmonic chanting creates standing waves in enclosed spaces. Certain resonant frequencies in temple chambers can affect brain activity through acoustic properties alone, entraining neural oscillations to match environmental vibrations. The Temple of Luxor's inner chambers amplify specific vocal tones while dampening others. The Great Pyramid's King's Chamber resonates at frequencies corresponding to theta waves. Was this intentional acoustic engineering? Modern testing confirms these properties exist. The question is whether Egyptians deliberately designed them or stumbled upon them and recognized their effects. Incense wasn't decorative. Frankincense contains boswellic acids that cross the blood-brain barrier and affect neurochemistry. Myrrh has documented psychoactive properties. Blue lotus, extensively used in Egyptian ceremonies, contains aporphine and nuciferine, compounds that produce mild euphoria and altered perception. Modern analysis confirms these plants genuinely affect consciousness. Egyptians didn't just burn pleasant-smelling substances. They used pharmacologically active compounds that enhanced ritual effectiveness through measurable neurological mechanisms. Fasting and sensory deprivation increase brain plasticity and can induce profound experiences through metabolic changes affecting neurotransmitters. The night ritual involved participants spending extended periods in complete darkness in underground temple chambers. Modern dark retreat research confirms this produces powerful psychological effects, including hallucinations, ego dissolution, mystical experiences. The opening of the mouth ceremony involved touching specific body points in sequence with specialized tools. These points correspond remarkably to acupuncture meridians and chakra locations described in other traditions, suggesting Egyptian awareness of subtle energy anatomy that multiple cultures mapped independently. Initiation rituals created symbolic death and rebirth experiences, powerful psychological processes that permanently alter personality and consciousness. Modern psychology recognizes these as transformative ego-death experiences that, when properly guided, produce lasting positive changes in worldview, values, and sense of self. Egyptian mystery schools weren't teaching information. They were transforming consciousness itself through direct experience of non-ordinary states, where realities inaccessible to normal awareness became temporarily available. Egyptian priests were consciousness engineers combining pharmacology, acoustics, architecture, social psychology, and symbolic manipulation to create predictable alterations in awareness that they could navigate and utilize. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was sophisticated applied psychology, using techniques modern science is only beginning to understand through research into psychedelic therapy, meditation retreats, and transformative experiences. Recent studies confirm such practices genuinely produce lasting beneficial changes in consciousness, perception, emotional regulation, and well-being when conducted properly. These techniques were kept secret, partly for power control, but partly because they're genuinely risky without proper preparation. Modern research into psychedelics and extreme meditation confirms this. Powerful consciousness-altering experiences can be therapeutic or traumatic depending on setting, guidance, and individual psychological readiness. Egyptian mystery schools prepared initiates gradually over years, ensuring stability before exposing them to more intense practices. The secrecy was protective, preventing unprepared people from accessing techniques that could harm them psychologically or spiritually. The knowledge transmitted through these rituals couldn't be written. You can't fully understand consciousness until you've experienced radically altered states. Egyptian initiation wasn't about learning facts. It was about transforming consciousness through direct experience of non-ordinary reality. Initiates weren't told about cosmic consciousness. They were given experiences that allowed them to perceive it directly. When the mystery schools closed, the practices died. They spent centuries perfecting techniques to alter consciousness deliberately. Darkness, sound, plants, timing, every element calibrated for effect. Modern neuroscience confirms it works. We're rediscovering what they mastered and lost. Within 7 years of opening Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, multiple expedition members died under circumstances the press attributed to an ancient curse. Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's financier, died months after the opening from an infected mosquito bite. George J. Gould visited the tomb and died of fever shortly afterward. Others followed in a pattern that seemed too consistent to be coincidence, too dramatic to be natural. The curse of the Pharaohs became legend, proof that Egyptian magic was real, that disturbing the dead carried consequences that modern science couldn't explain or prevent. Statistical analysis tells a different story. people directly involved in opening the tomb didn't die at rates significantly higher than expected for their ages, health conditions, and circumstances. Howard Carter himself, who spent years working directly inside the tomb, lived another 17 years. Most supposed curse victims were elderly, already ill, or died from clearly identifiable causes unrelated to tomb exposure. The curse narrative was amplified by sensationalist journalism, hungry for supernatural angles, not supported by careful epidemiological analysis. From this perspective, the curse of the Pharaohs is myth, coincidences, and confirmation bias, creating patterns where none actually exist. But tombs genuinely contain biological hazards. Sealed chambers preserve fungal spores that remain viable for millennia. Aspergillus species can cause fatal infections in people with compromised immune systems, which many elderly expedition members had. Toxic minerals used in preservation and decoration create hazardous dust. Arsenic compounds in pigments. Mercury used in certain preparations. Bat guano in sealed chambers produces histoplasmosis, a potentially fatal respiratory infection. Radiation from uranium-containing pigments. These aren't magical curses. They're genuine public health hazards that could explain mysterious illnesses and deaths among people who spent extended time in enclosed ancient spaces breathing contaminated air. Egyptian priests might have known tombs became toxic over time. Thousands of years of observation would have shown that people who entered old sealed tombs often became ill. They couldn't explain it through germ theory or radiation, but they recognized the pattern. The curse inscriptions might have been psychological deterrents backed by genuine empirical knowledge that tombs were dangerous. The magic was real, but the mechanism was microbial and chemical rather than supernatural. The psychological dimension adds another layer. The nocebo effect, negative placebo, is well documented. Belief in a curse can create genuine physiological effects, including illness and death through stress hormone cascades, immune suppression, and psychosomatic responses. If someone believes they're cursed, that belief becomes self-fulfilling through measurable biological mechanisms. Egyptian priests understood psychological power and deliberately crafted threatening inscriptions to create fear. Whether curses had supernatural components or not, they achieved their protective purpose through psychology backed by real biological hazards. Could there be something more? Could Egyptian curses involve consciousness-based effects beyond psychology and toxins? Curses were created through specific rituals involving objects, materials, and intention-setting ceremonies. If consciousness affects physical systems, as some quantum experiments tentatively suggest, could intensely focused malevolent intention embedded in objects through ritual create genuine negative effects on people who encounter them? This remains scientifically unproven, but aligns with Egyptian understanding of Heka as consciousness affecting reality through mechanisms we don't fully comprehend. Tomb curses were multi-layered protection systems, physical hazards including biological toxins and radiation, psychological warfare through threatening inscriptions that created fear and stress, social pressure from religious taboos that deterred violation through cultural conditioning, and possibly energetic mechanisms from ritual curse embedding. Egyptian priests didn't rely on single protective methods. They created comprehensive security systems that worked through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. Whether magical components functioned or not, the practical components ensured effectiveness. Most curse effects are explainable through biology, psychology, coincidence, but Egyptian priests created sophisticated systems combining verified knowledge about toxins and human psychology with possible energetic practices we don't fully understand. Whether curses actually worked depends on which mechanism you're examining. Biological hazards definitely worked. Psychological effects definitely worked. Energetic effects remain unproven, but can't be entirely dismissed given gaps in our understanding of consciousness-matter interaction. They died within years of entering the tomb. Coincidence, bacteria, or something else? Egyptian curses combined psychology, toxins, and possibly forces we still don't understand. The question isn't whether curses worked. It's which mechanisms worked, and which ones we've rediscovered, versus which remain lost. Hollywood shows you whips and chains, emaciated workers dragging stones under the brutal Egyptian sun, while overseers beat anyone who slows down. This image of pyramid construction is so embedded in popular imagination that challenging it feels almost heretical. But archaeology tells a different story, one that's more interesting and more unsettling than the narrative we've been taught. The pyramids weren't built by slaves. They were built by citizens who were fed, housed, cared for, and buried with honor near the monuments they created. The evidence comes from workers' villages discovered near pyramid sites. Substantial housing with multiple rooms, not cramped slave quarters. Food remains showing regular meat consumption. Expensive protein that indicates good rations rather than starvation diets. Medical facilities where workers received treatment for injuries, with healed fractures showing they weren't simply discarded when injured. Burial sites near the pyramids, where workers were interred with care, suggesting honored status rather than mass graves of disposable labor. This isn't what slavery looks like archaeologically. Look at the graffiti inside pyramid chambers. Work gang inscriptions with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. These aren't the words of oppressed people, scratching desperate messages in the dark. These are team names, expressions of pride, markers of identity, administrative papyri document rotation systems where workers served defined periods, then returned home, structured labor service, rather than permanent bondage. The system resembles modern national service or conscription more than chattel slavery. The mechanism was corvée labor, a form of taxation through work rather than money. During agricultural off-seasons, when the Nile flooded fields and farmers couldn't work their land, they joined construction projects. This solved multiple problems simultaneously, kept rural populations employed during idle months, generated national infrastructure, fostered unity through shared purpose. The work was hard, physically demanding, dangerous, but it was temporary, compensated with food and housing, and considered religious service. Building the pharaoh's eternal resting place meant participating in cosmic order, ensuring prosperity for all Egypt. Motivation beyond mere coercion. Consider the sophistication required. Pyramid construction needed skilled masons who could cut stone precisely, engineers who understood mathematics and structural forces, metal workers who maintained tools, surveyors who established alignments, administrators who coordinated thousands of workers, specialized craftspeople who created finishing elements. Slavery doesn't produce skilled labor. You can force someone to move stones through threat of violence, but you can't force precision, innovation, quality, craftsmanship, or the problem-solving required when challenges arise. The mathematical accuracy, architectural sophistication, and artistic excellence evident in pyramids required workers who were invested, trained, and valued enough to care about their work's quality. Egyptian labor systems challenge fundamental assumptions about ancient civilizations requiring slavery for monumental projects. Egypt accomplished extraordinary construction not through brutal oppression, but through organized cooperation, religious motivation, and reasonable compensation. This suggests a civilization more socially sophisticated than typically credited. The slavery narrative persists partly from biblical traditions. The Exodus story that places Hebrew slaves building Egyptian monuments despite questionable historical support, and partly from projection, modern people assuming ancient achievements required methods we'd consider necessary. Modern nations accomplish massive projects through military conscription, public works programs, national service systems. All are forms of temporary labor mobilization for collective benefit. Egyptian corvée resembles these more than chattel slavery. Workers served their period, received compensation, returned home. Yes, Egypt had slavery. Prisoners of war, debt bondage, household servants. But evidence increasingly suggests slaves weren't primary pyramid workers. Some workers suffered, certainly. Accidents, disease, harsh conditions, but the overall system appears less brutal and more organized than popular imagination suggests. They built monuments, standing 4,500 years later. We assumed slavery because that's what we'd expect. But the workers were fed meat, received medical care, and buried with honor near their creations. They weren't slaves, forced to build monuments to tyranny. They were citizens building forever, participating in something larger than individual lives, creating structures that would outlast their civilization itself. Egypt wasn't just ancient. It was ancient for an impossibly long time. Consider this perspective. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, lived closer to our present day than to the construction of the Great Pyramid. The civilization she ruled had already existed for nearly 3,000 years when she was born. 3,000 years of continuous cultural identity, governmental systems, religious practices, and administrative structures. Most civilizations don't exist for 3 centuries. Egypt maintained recognizable continuity across 3 millennia. The organizational achievement this represents deserves study as much as any pyramid. The structure was layered and sophisticated. The pharaoh held absolute authority theoretically, but practically governed through elaborate bureaucratic hierarchy. Viziers served as chief administrators, essentially prime ministers managing day-to-day governance. Nomarchs governed regions, implementing central policies while maintaining local control. Scribes formed the educated administrative class, keeping records and managing information flow. Specialized officials oversaw taxation, irrigation management, construction projects, military organization, religious affairs, and legal disputes. This wasn't simple despotism, with one ruler dictating everything. This was systematic governance, with documentation, standardization, accountability, and trained personnel at multiple levels. Scribes were crucial. They formed a self-perpetuating educated elite, maintaining institutional memory across generations. Becoming a scribe required years of education in temple schools, learning hieratic script for administrative writing, mathematics for accounting, law for dispute resolution, and various practical skills for governance. Scribes were exempt from physical labor and taxation, enjoying elevated social status that made the career attractive to ambitious families. The Satire of the Trades, a Middle Kingdom text still taught to students, describes various occupations unfavorably while praising the scribe's comfortable life. Educational propaganda, encouraging literacy and administrative training, creating the personnel needed to maintain complex governance. Look at what they documented. Census records tracking population, movements and growth. Property registers documenting land ownership and transfers. Tax records calculating revenue from agriculture and trade. Ration documents managing food distribution to workers and officials. Construction logs tracking materials, workers, and progress. Legal records documenting disputes and judgments. Thousands of papyri survive, showing everyday administration. This wasn't primitive government stumbling through decisions. This was systematic bureaucracy that modern states would recognize, scaled to manage irrigation systems, agricultural cycles, construction projects, and trade networks across territory spanning hundreds of miles. The continuity explains how technological and cultural knowledge persisted across such timescales. When governmental institutions endure across centuries, they create organizational memory. Techniques, practices, and knowledge become embedded in institutional culture, independent of individuals. Modern corporations and governments operate similarly. Individual employees change, but institutional knowledge persists through documentation, training programs, and workplace culture. Egypt achieved this on civilizational scale. Even when dynasties changed, when foreign conquerors took power, the administrative systems often continued because they worked and because the scribal class maintained them, regardless of who nominally ruled. The intermediate periods demonstrate this by negative example. When central authority collapsed and Egypt fragmented into competing regions, the results were dramatic. Reduced construction quality, loss of standardization, cultural disruption, decreased technological capability. When administration was restored and centralized control re-established, capabilities returned. This demonstrates that Egyptian achievements depended fundamentally on systematic organization rather than individual genius or divine favor. Remove the organizational infrastructure and capabilities disappear. Restore it, and they return. The irony is that bureaucracy was so successful, it became invisible. We marvel at pyramids and temples, but overlook the organizational capabilities required to produce them. The monuments we see were outputs of systems we don't see. Record keeping, logistics, planning, resource management, labor coordination. These boring administrative capabilities were more fundamental to Egyptian success than any individual technological innovation. A well-organized civilization with simple tools will outperform a disorganized civilization with advanced tools every time. When Rome conquered Egypt, they largely adopted Egyptian administrative systems because they were effective. Byzantine Empire continued many Egyptian governmental practices. Elements of Egyptian bureaucracy survived into medieval administration and influenced modern structures. 3,000 years, longer than most nations exist at all. Through dynasties, invasions, revolutions, their administration persisted. The pyramids impress us, but the bureaucracy that built them was the real achievement. Ancient Egypt operated on simple barter, right? Farmers trading grain for pottery, craftsmen exchanging goods directly, no money or sophisticated commerce. That's the standard assumption about ancient economies. The evidence says otherwise. Egypt developed financial concepts and practices that modern economies reinvented millennia later. Credit systems, abstract currency, futures contracts, insurance, banking. Financial instruments we associate with capitalism existed in recognizable forms thousands of years before Adam Smith. The deben and kite were standardized units of value used in Egyptian transactions. Not physical coinage came much later with the Lydians and Greeks. These were accounting units representing specific weights of copper or silver. Workers received wages calculated in deben. Goods were priced in deben. Transactions were recorded in deben. This created abstract currency, allowing complex economic activity without physically exchanging metals every time. The concept that value can be represented abstractly and transferred through record-keeping rather than physical goods represents sophisticated economic understanding. It's essentially what modern fiat currency does, backed by institutional trust rather than intrinsic commodity value. Look at evidence of credit and lending. Contracts documenting loans with specified interest rates. Grain lent during planting season, repaid after harvest with additional grain as interest. These are futures contracts, agreements about future delivery of goods at predetermined terms. Property deeds, showing land transfers with payment over time. Installment purchases requiring trust in contractual enforcement. Receipts documenting deposits in temple and palace storehouses, functioning as banks, where individuals stored grain or valuables and withdrew them later. Some evidence suggests these deposits could be transferred to third parties, creating negotiable instruments. Understanding that present goods are worth more than future goods, that risk requires compensation, that contracts must be enforceable. Insurance concepts appear in mutual aid societies, groups of workers or merchants pooling resources to protect against individual loss. If one member's crops failed or trading expedition was lost, the pool provided support. This cooperative risk-sharing is the fundamental principle underlying all insurance. Egyptian benevolent associations, documented in worker communities, provided disability support, funeral expenses, survivor benefits. Social insurance predating modern welfare states by thousands of years, arising from recognition that collective risk-sharing benefits everyone by reducing individual vulnerability to catastrophic loss. Egyptian texts reveal understanding of economic principles, supply-demand relationships affecting prices. Good harvests lowered grain prices. Poor harvests raised them. Inflation, where increased money supply decreased purchasing power. Investment returns, recognizing that lending grain returned more than storing it. Price tracking over time, showing administrators monitored economic indicators and adjusted policies accordingly. Proto-economic planning, based on empirical observation of how commerce functions. Trade networks extended throughout the Mediterranean, Near East, and Africa. Long-distance commerce required sophisticated instruments. Letters of credit allowing merchants to conduct transactions far from home. Commodity contracts specifying future delivery terms. Partnership agreements dividing profits and risks among investors. These instruments require institutional trust, contract enforcement, and standardized practices. The foundation of commercial civilization, Egypt developed these not from abstract theory, but from practical necessity. Creating systems that worked so well, subsequent civilizations adopted them. When modern banking emerged in Renaissance Italy, it reinvented concepts Egyptians had used. Deposit banking, letters of credit, partnership contracts, standardized value units. The Egyptians didn't invent capitalism, but they developed many core financial instruments because those instruments solve universal commercial problems. Any sufficiently complex economy generates similar solutions independently because the problems are fundamental. They had credit, interest rates, standardized currency, insurance, and banking 3,000 years before modern finance emerged. We think we invented these systems, that they're products of enlightenment, rationality, or capitalist innovation. We just rediscovered what they already knew, what practical commerce inevitably generates when civilization reaches sufficient complexity. Another case of knowledge lost and laboriously reconstructed rather than continuous improvement. The Persian army crossed into Egypt in 525 years before Christ, ending 3,000 years of continuous Egyptian rule. Alexander the Great conquered it again 3 centuries later. Rome absorbed it as a province in 30 years before the Common Era. Christianity suppressed the old gods in the 4th century after Christ. Over 800 years, the Egyptian priesthood went from powerful knowledge keepers, maintaining traditions stretching back millennia, to persecuted remnants practicing forbidden rites in secret, and finally, to extinction. The last hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 in the Common Era. After that, nobody could read the ancient writing. The knowledge system that had preserved Egyptian wisdom for thousands of years simply stopped functioning. But knowledge doesn't disappear when institutions collapse. It transforms, migrates, hides in new forms. In the centuries before complete suppression, Greek intellectuals encountered Egyptian priests and absorbed what they could understand. Pythagoras studied in Egyptian temples, bringing back mathematical mysticism that became foundational to Greek philosophy. Plato's cosmology shows obvious Egyptian influence, his ideal forms resembling the Egyptian concept of divine principles manifesting in reality. Herodotus documented Egyptian practices, preserving descriptions that would otherwise be lost. Later scholars visited temples, learned from priests, and translated Egyptian concepts into Greek philosophical language. This created Hermetic philosophy, ostensibly Greek texts, but claiming Egyptian origin and containing recognizable Egyptian ideas filtered through Hellenic frameworks. The Library of Alexandria became the meeting place, where Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and other traditions merged. Scholars compared different knowledge systems, finding parallels and synthesizing new understandings. This syncretism preserved Egyptian knowledge, but transformed it in the process. Egyptian wisdom became Greco-Egyptian philosophy, losing experiential elements while gaining intellectual sophistication. The practical techniques taught in temples became abstract principles discussed in academies. As Christianity became dominant in the Roman Empire, pagan temples were systematically closed, priests were dispersed, indigenous traditions forbidden, ancient practices condemned as demonic. Some Egyptian priests converted to Christianity, possibly carrying knowledge into Christian mysticism and Gnostic sects that combined Christian theology with esoteric practices. Others fled to remote areas, continuing traditions in secret until the last practitioners died. Still, others may have transmitted knowledge to communities that preserved it orally or in disguised forms that wouldn't attract persecution. Egyptian knowledge survived, but not as Egyptian knowledge. It survived disguised within other traditions, transformed almost beyond recognition. Hermetic texts transmitted Egyptian cosmology through Greek philosophical vocabulary. Gnostic Christianity incorporated Egyptian mystical concepts, particularly ideas about multiple levels of reality and consciousness transformation. Jewish Kabbalah absorbed Egyptian magic and symbolism, influenced during the Israelites' time in Egypt and later interactions. Islamic mysticism developed in Egypt and integrated local pre-Islamic wisdom that had roots in pharaonic traditions. Medieval European alchemy claimed Egyptian origin through Hermes Trismegistus, supposedly an ancient Egyptian sage. Renaissance Hermetic revival reintroduced Egyptian concepts to European thought. Freemasonry adopted Egyptian symbols and initiation structures. The transmission line is convoluted, often distorted, but threads of Egyptian understanding can be traced through Western esoteric traditions. The tragedy lies in distorted transmission. Each layer of translation, cultural adaptation, and theological reinterpretation altered the original knowledge. Greek philosophers intellectualized it, removing experiential components that couldn't be conveyed through philosophical discourse. Christian theologians moralized it, stripping away magical and technical practices while preserving ethical principles. Islamic scholars integrated it into entirely different cosmologies. European alchemists fantasized and mystified it, adding symbolic layers that obscured rather than clarified. By the time Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Egypt through Hermetic texts, they were reading third or fourth-hand translations, filtered through multiple incompatible cultural frameworks. Like a joke translated through 5 languages, something survived the journey, but not what was originally expressed. Distortion was inevitable because written texts couldn't preserve experiential knowledge. Egyptian wisdom was practical, learned through direct experience, under guidance, initiates practice techniques, experienced altered states, developed capacities that couldn't be conveyed through words alone. Imagine teaching surgery from textbooks without demonstrations. You might understand anatomical descriptions but couldn't perform operations. Later traditions inherited Egyptian texts and symbols, but not the living knowledge of how to use them. So they created new meanings based on their own contexts, inadvertently transforming Egyptian wisdom into something different. When temples closed and hieroglyphs became unreadable, the priests didn't just vanish. They fled into other traditions, carrying pieces of Egyptian wisdom that surfaced in Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, Christian Gnosticism, Islamic Sufism, and European alchemy. Fragments survived, but the whole was lost. Medieval European scholars discovered Greek and Arabic texts containing mysterious references to Egyptian wisdom attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, supposedly an ancient Egyptian sage who revealed profound secrets about reality, consciousness, and magic. These Hermetic texts became foundational to European occultism, studied by everyone from Renaissance philosophers to Enlightenment alchemists. But their origin remains debated. Were they genuine Egyptian knowledge preserved through Greek translation, or Greek philosophy dressed in Egyptian clothing to claim ancient authority? The Corpus Hermeticum collected Greek texts written around the 1st through 3rd centuries in the Common Era, claimed to record Egyptian wisdom. Medieval Europeans believed these were genuinely ancient, predating Moses, containing pristine knowledge from humanity's earliest civilization. Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno built entire philosophical systems on Hermetic principles. Later, scholarship dated the texts much later and recognized them as Greco-Egyptian syncretism, Greek philosophy using Egyptian symbolism rather than pure Egyptian knowledge. But this doesn't mean they contain no Egyptian content. They likely represent attempts to translate Egyptian concepts into Greek frameworks by people who had access to Egyptian priests and teachings but understood them through Hellenic perspectives. Egyptian magical papyri from the Greco-Roman period show the blending process clearly. These texts invoke Egyptian deities alongside Greek gods. They use Greek language but Egyptian ritual structures. They combine philosophical speculation with practical magic formulas. When these texts and similar Arabic magical manuscripts reached medieval Europe through Muslim Spain and Crusader contact, European scribes copied and adapted them, creating grimoires like the Key of Solomon, the Picatrix, and the Book of Abramelin. All claimed ancient origin. All contained obvious Egyptian influences, filtered through multiple cultural transformations. Egyptian concepts transformed radically through this transmission. Egyptian Neteru, divine principles or powers, manifesting different aspects of reality, became medieval demons and angels, personified entities Christians could invoke or banish. Egyptian magical techniques using divine names and ritual actions became ceremonial magic formulas that European magicians practiced in secret. Egyptian initiation structures, progressive degrees revealing deeper secrets to qualified students, became secret society models used by Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and Hermetic orders. Egyptian amulet magic became European talismanic practice. The symbolic vocabulary remained recognizably Egyptian, with ankhs, pyramids, and hieroglyphic characters appearing throughout grimoires. But the understanding changed. Europeans interpreted these symbols through Christian theology, Jewish Kabbalah, and Neoplatonic philosophy, frameworks completely foreign to original Egyptian contexts. Medieval and Renaissance magicians genuinely believed they were practicing Egyptian magic, and to some extent they were, but through so many filters that the original system was fundamentally transformed. Like jazz musicians playing Mozart, technically the same notes, but with completely different interpretation, feeling, and context. European occultists preserved some authentic Egyptian techniques, including visualization practices, ritual structure, and symbolic manipulation. but they completely misunderstood the cosmological and philosophical frameworks in which Egyptians originally practiced them. The 19th century brought renewed fascination when Napoleon's expedition to Egypt and subsequent hieroglyphic decipherment sparked Egyptomania. Occult groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn attempted to reconstruct Egyptian magical practices using newly translated texts, but their reconstructions were heavily influenced by Victorian ceremonial magic, theosophical philosophy, and spiritualist practices. They created systems they sincerely believed were authentically Egyptian, but which modern Egyptologists recognize as creative synthesis rather than historical reconstruction. Do these modern magical systems work? Practitioners claim they do, achieving altered states, psychological transformation, sometimes practical effects. But whether they work because they preserve genuine Egyptian techniques, or because any systematic consciousness practice can be effective, regardless of historical authenticity, remains debatable. Placebo works whether medicine is genuine or not. The systems may be historically inaccurate, yet practically useful. Efficacy and authenticity are separate questions. The Egyptian to European magical transmission, though distorted, demonstrates how knowledge systems survive civilizational collapse, not intact, but in transformed states. Every revival, reinterpretation, and reconstruction adds new layers while potentially losing old ones. We can't fully separate genuine Egyptian content from later additions. Medieval magicians thought they were practicing Egyptian magic. They used Egyptian symbols, invoked Egyptian gods, followed Egyptian-style rituals, but they were reading third-hand translations filtered through incompatible worldviews. Was it Egyptian wisdom or elaborate imagination? Both, probably, mixed so thoroughly we can't separate them. Egypt never completely died. The language evolved into Coptic rather than vanishing entirely. Some religious practices transformed into folk traditions that persist today. Architectural styles influenced later building across the Mediterranean world. Genetic continuity means modern Egyptians are descendants of ancient Egyptians, inheriting biological connections to the civilization we study as ancient history. But cultural continuity is complex. Languages change beyond recognition. Religions replace each other completely. Cultural memory fades, even when populations persist in the same territory. What remains of ancient Egypt in modern Egypt? More than nothing, less than everything. The Coptic Christian tradition represents the most direct link. Coptic is the last evolutionary stage of the Egyptian language, written in Greek letters, but preserving Egyptian vocabulary and grammar. Coptic Christians consider themselves descendants of ancient Egyptians, maintaining distinct cultural identity separate from the later Arab Islamic majority. Coptic liturgy preserves ancient Egyptian musical elements. Ethnomusicologists have identified melodic patterns in Coptic hymns that appear to derive from pharaonic temple music, transmitted orally through unbroken tradition spanning thousands of years. Coptic religious art shows clear influence from ancient iconography. Mary holding infant Jesus mirrors Isis holding infant Horus, the same pose, the same symbolic relationship. Some Coptic festivals align with ancient Egyptian religious calendars, celebrating at times that correspond to pharaonic holy days. These are genuine cultural survivals, not later reconstructions but living continuity. Broader Egyptian culture preserves elements too. Agricultural practices along the Nile follow patterns established millennia ago because the river's behavior hasn't fundamentally changed. Traditional boat building preserves ancient designs visible in pharaonic reliefs. Architectural elements in Islamic Cairo show influences from pharaonic aesthetics. Folk magic practices, documented by anthropologists, contain elements recognizable from ancient magical papyri. Same plants, same symbolic gestures, same underlying concepts, though reinterpreted through Islamic theological frameworks. Modern Egyptian Arabic preserves Coptic vocabulary, and therefore ancient Egyptian words embedded in everyday speech. Cultural knowledge embedded in daily practice can persist even when civilizations officially end. Modern genetic research confirms that modern Egyptians are genetically continuous with ancient Egyptians. Near Eastern admixture from subsequent migrations added to the population, but the core remained. This means whatever ancient Egyptians knew genetically or culturally that wasn't recorded in texts potentially still exists in the population. Folk knowledge passed through families. Crafts transmitted master to apprentice across generations. intuitions and cognitive patterns shaped by the same environment, the same river, the same landscape for thousands of years. Egyptian knowledge might survive in non-textual forms that scholarship hasn't adequately studied because it privileges written evidence over living tradition. Modern efforts to recover Egyptian knowledge take multiple approaches. Scholars study Coptic texts for preserved Egyptian wisdom. Anthropologists document folk practices that might derive from pharaonic antecedents. Alternative researchers interview rural Egyptians about traditional techniques, sometimes discovering practices surprisingly similar to ancient descriptions. These efforts are controversial. Mainstream Egyptology tends to privilege archaeological and textual evidence over folk memory, treating oral tradition as unreliable. Alternative researchers sometimes overstate continuity, seeing Egyptian connections where coincidence or later introduction better explain similarities. The truth likely lies between extremes. Academic reconstruction and living tradition offer different pathways to understanding. Egyptologists reconstruct ancient Egypt from artifacts and texts, creating intellectually rigorous but potentially sterile knowledge divorced from lived experience. Living traditions like Coptic Christianity and folk practices maintain cultural continuity, but with transformations so extensive that direct connections remain questionable. Which preserves more genuine Egyptian knowledge? Careful scholarly reconstruction from ancient evidence, or imperfectly remembered traditions passed down through generations? Both capture different aspects of what Egyptian culture was. Neither provides complete access to what was lost. Civilizations don't absolutely end. They transform, merge, persist in altered forms. Ancient Egypt lives in modern Egypt in ways both obvious and subtle. The language survives in church services. The music persists in hymns. Genetic tests confirm population continuity. But much was genuinely lost. The majority of Egyptian knowledge existing only in priestly training, oral tradition, and experiential practice died when those institutions collapsed. What remains are fragments, hints, echoes of what was. Ancient Egypt didn't completely die. It transformed into modern Egypt, but the transformation was so profound that recognizing what survived requires careful attention to traces most people walk past without noticing. The Egyptians possessed knowledge that took 3,000 years to develop. Within 3 centuries of their civilization's fall, much of it was completely forgotten, not lost in fires or floods, not destroyed by invading armies. Forgotten. The texts survived physically, but became meaningless symbols. The techniques survived in fragments, but without context to make them useful. The understanding simply evaporated, leaving behind artifacts we can measure but not fully comprehend. How does this happen? How does knowledge accumulated across millennia vanish within generations? The first mechanism is institutional collapse. Egyptian knowledge wasn't stored primarily in books. It lived in institutions. Temples where priests trained for decades. Houses of life, where scholars studied and taught. Craft guilds, where masters passed techniques to apprentices. These institutions maintained living knowledge through practice and transmission. When temples closed, when guilds disbanded, when lineages ended, the knowledge embedded in these communities died with them. You can't learn surgery from textbooks alone. You can't master stone cutting from written descriptions. You need teachers, practice, institutional support. When institutions collapse suddenly, knowledge vanishes regardless of how many books survive. The second mechanism is language barriers. When Coptic replaced hieroglyphic Egyptian, then Arabic replaced Coptic, each transition created walls between present and past. Texts survived physically but became unreadable, transforming knowledge into meaningless marks on stone and papyrus. For 14 centuries, nobody could read hieroglyphs, despite them being visible on monuments throughout Egypt. The information existed, but was inaccessible. Modern parallel. Digital data encoded in obsolete formats becomes equally inaccessible when software and hardware to read it disappear. We assume digital storage is permanent, but file formats change, encoding standards evolve, and future generations might possess our data files but lack ability to decode them. The third mechanism is social disruption. Wars scatter knowledge-bearing communities. Conquest displaces populations. Religious persecution silences practitioners. Economic collapse breaks the social conditions that support specialized knowledge. Egyptian priests scattered when temples closed. Their knowledge scattered with them, fragmenting into pieces held by different groups who could no longer communicate. Some converted to Christianity, carrying fragments into new contexts, where they were reinterpreted beyond recognition. Others fled to remote areas, where their knowledge died with them. War, climate change, or economic collapse could similarly displace scientific communities, break supply chains, maintaining technology, disrupt the stability that specialized knowledge requires. The fourth mechanism is value shifts. What one generation considers invaluable, the next dismisses as worthless. Egyptian religious knowledge became pagan superstition under Christian rule, leading to deliberate destruction of texts and active suppression of practices. Knowledge was lost not through accident, but through rejection. Certain types of understanding, traditional ecological knowledge, craft skills, contemplative practices, get devalued because they don't fit modern economic or scientific frameworks. This neglect leads inevitably to loss, as practitioners die without finding students who care enough to learn. These mechanisms don't operate alone. They reinforce each other, creating cascading failures. Egyptian knowledge didn't disappear overnight. It degraded over centuries as institutions weakened, languages changed, communities dispersed, values shifted. Each factor alone might not be fatal. Combined, they create erosion that eventually becomes irreversible. By the time people realize valuable knowledge is disappearing, the specialists who possessed it are dead, the institutions that preserved it are gone, and recovery becomes archaeological puzzle rather than simple retrieval. Our civilization centralizes knowledge in universities, corporations, databases, creating single points of failure. We encode knowledge digitally, creating format dependency. We specialize intensely, creating situations where crucial understanding exists in few minds. We prioritize economically valuable knowledge, creating risk that non-commercial wisdom is lost. We assume documentation captures knowledge, ignoring tacit understanding, embodied skills, experiential wisdom that can't be written down. These aren't necessarily fatal flaws, but they're vulnerabilities. Egypt had 3,000 years to secure their knowledge. They documented it extensively, institutionalized it thoroughly, trained specialists carefully. Within 300 years of collapse, most was lost. What makes us think our knowledge is more secure than theirs was? The Egyptians seemed aware their civilization might not last forever. Why else build in stone rather than wood? Why encode knowledge in geometry and astronomical alignments? Why create redundant preservation systems across multiple monuments? Perhaps they understood from experience, possibly remembering previous civilizations, that knowledge can be lost. Perhaps they attempted to create preservation methods resistant to the very mechanisms of forgetting they'd witnessed or feared. Pyramids and temples weren't just religious structures. They were information storage systems, encoding knowledge in physical form that survives what books cannot. Mathematical relationships embedded in dimensions. Astronomical alignments built into orientation. Geometric principles expressed in proportions. Physical encyclopedia, resistant to fire, flood, language change, institutional collapse. Books burn, languages die, institutions fail. But stone structures persist for millennia. If you wanted to preserve knowledge for 10,000 years, encoding it in massive monuments might be the most reliable method available. The Great Pyramid encodes pi in the ratio of height to base perimeter. It encodes phi in internal chamber dimensions. Its latitude matches the speed of light in meters per second. Its base dimensions relate to Earth's circumference and radius. Coincidence seems increasingly implausible given the number of correlations. The Temple of Luxor's floor plan encodes human body proportions at architectural scale. Hieroglyphs function as both phonetic script and ideographic symbols, creating redundancy where meaning might be recovered even if pronunciation is lost. The symbolic vocabulary repeats consistently across thousands of monuments, ensuring that fragmentary survival still allows pattern recognition. These weren't accidents. They suggest deliberate design with long-term preservation in mind. Modern civilization faces similar challenges. How do you warn humans 10,000 years in the future about radioactive waste sites when current languages will be dead and current civilizations might be gone? The nuclear semiotics problem. Proposed solutions include pictographic warnings, massive marker monuments, encoded information in dimensions, symbolic systems designed to be universally recognizable. These modern proposals resemble Egyptian preservation strategies, suggesting that deep-time communication generates similar solutions regardless of era. The Egyptians were attempting something we're only now beginning to appreciate: creating messages that survive civilizational death. Egyptian preservation strategies partially succeeded. Monuments survive, symbols persist. Mathematical encoding remains detectable after 4,500 years, but the context needed to fully understand them was lost. This reveals a fundamental challenge. Preserving information physically is achievable. Preserving interpretive context is vastly harder. Future archaeologists measure pyramid dimensions accurately, but might miss the significance Egyptians intended. We decode their messages and recover some content while completely missing other layers. Monument as message works imperfectly, better than complete loss but far from perfect preservation. Context is hardest to preserve because it's non-physical. It exists in training, culture, shared assumptions, experiential knowledge. You can't carve context into stone because context is relationships, practices, ways of thinking, rather than discrete facts. The Egyptians understood this problem. They used initiation systems to preserve context through human transmission. They created redundant encoding to preserve information through multiple methods. They developed symbolic systems attempting to communicate across cultural boundaries. But all these methods depend on continuous maintenance. When maintenance stops, degradation begins immediately. No preservation method survives. Total civilizational collapse intact. Writing survives physically, but becomes unreadable. Oral tradition survives flexibly, but distorts over time. Craft knowledge survives in practice, but vanishes when practice stops. Institutional knowledge survives, while institutions persist, but not after. The conclusion is sobering. No method perfectly preserves knowledge across complete civilizational discontinuity. The best possible approach is creating redundancy, multiple preservation methods with different failure modes, hoping something survives in some form. Our preservation attempts include digital archives, vulnerable to format obsolescence, scientific papers requiring interpretive communities, museums requiring continuous maintenance, education systems requiring stable civilization. Are we preserving knowledge better than Egyptians, or just differently? Our methods aren't obviously superior. They might be more efficient short-term, but equally vulnerable to long-term loss. The Egyptian example demands humility. Despite enormous effort and sophisticated strategies, they couldn't fully preserve their knowledge across civilizational collapse. They built forever. They encoded everything. They created backups in stone, and still, most was lost. We trust digital files and cloud storage. Are we any smarter than they were? Imagine the last Egyptian priests who understood the full tradition, watching their civilization crumble, knowing the knowledge accumulated across 3,000 years was dying with them. What would they try to preserve? What message would they carve for whoever came after? What wisdom would they consider essential enough to fight against inevitable loss? Though speculative, this thought experiment helps extract lessons from Egypt's example that apply to our own relationship with knowledge and the future. First lesson: knowledge is fragile. Modern civilization operates under implicit assumption that knowledge once discovered is permanently secured, that progress is irreversible, that accumulated understanding can't be lost. Egyptian experience contradicts this completely. They possessed knowledge requiring millennia to develop. They lost much within centuries. Progress isn't guaranteed. Knowledge isn't automatically preserved. Civilizational continuity requires active maintenance. Complacency about knowledge security is dangerous. The Egyptians knew things we had to rediscover: medical procedures, construction techniques, astronomical understanding. Forgetting is real. Reverse progress is possible. Second lesson: wisdom isn't the same as information. Egyptians didn't just accumulate facts. They developed integrated understanding, connecting medicine, astronomy, mathematics, spirituality, social organization into coherent worldview. Modern civilization excels at information accumulation, but struggles with integration. We have vast data, but arguably less wisdom about living well, organizing society sustainably, maintaining long-term perspective. Egyptian emphasis on ma'at, represented attempt to ground human society in fundamental reality, seeking alignment with how things actually are rather than imposing arbitrary systems. This integration of knowledge into lived wisdom represents something worth recovering. Third lesson. Experiential knowledge matters as much as abstract knowledge. Egyptians valued direct experience, initiation practices transforming consciousness, craft skills developed through years of practice, embodied understanding that couldn't be written. Modern education emphasizes abstract knowledge while devaluing experiential understanding. Facts, theories, information, but not contemplative, practice, craft mastery, embodied wisdom. The Egyptian example suggests civilizations that lose experiential connection become intellectually rich, but existentially impoverished. Knowing much, but understanding less. Restoring balance between abstract and experiential, theoretical and practical, information and transformation might be essential for genuine human flourishing. Fourth lesson. Specialization creates vulnerability. Egyptian knowledge was compartmentalized. Different priestly orders knew different things. This created preservation through redundancy, but also vulnerability if all lineages failed simultaneously. Modern civilization is intensely specialized, with crucial knowledge existing in few minds. Efficient but brittle. The Egyptian example suggests some knowledge should be widely distributed rather than narrowly specialized. That crucial understanding should be accessible to non-specialists, that creating redundancy in knowledge preservation is worth apparent inefficiency. The synthesis. Egyptian civilization's greatest achievement wasn't pyramids or medical procedures or astronomical calculations. It was maintaining continuous cultural and intellectual tradition for 3,000 years. That continuity, not individual accomplishments, represents the real marvel. Modern civilization measures success by innovation and advancement, but perhaps sustainability and continuity deserve equal value. A civilization lasting 3,000 years, even without rapid innovation, achieves something more valuable than one advancing rapidly, but collapsing after 300 years. Egyptian emphasis on stability, tradition, continuity, often dismissed as conservative stagnation, might represent wisdom about long-term civilizational success that innovation-obsessed modern culture needs to hear. Egypt fell not because they were primitive, but despite being sophisticated. Their knowledge systems were excellent by ancient standards, yet proved insufficient against forces that destroyed them. This should make us humble. If they, with all their wisdom and effort, couldn't preserve their civilization and knowledge, why assume we'll succeed? But it should also make us determined. They preserved fragments despite everything, giving us glimpses of their understanding. If we face similar challenges, perhaps we too can preserve enough that future civilizations, however different from ours, can learn from our example and rebuild from our fragments. 3,000 years they lasted. They knew things we're still trying to understand. They tried to preserve it forever. And still, much was lost. What would they tell us if they could? Build for eternity. Teach the next generation. Remember that nothing is permanent, but something always survives. The stones remain, carrying messages we're only beginning to understand. What will we leave for those who come after us? What knowledge will we preserve? What wisdom will survive when our certainties become dust? Perhaps that's the question every civilization must answer while there's still time.